homeless teenager walks onto a stranger's property with nothing but the clothes on his back, and within 2 years he is standing in the middle of an NFL draft room as a first-round talent. But almost every review of this film gets the story backwards. This was never really a football movie. It was a story about the exact moment one family decided to actually see a person everyone else had trained themselves to look past. And by the time the credits roll, you may find yourself questioning who really did the rescuing here, because the answer is not as simple as it first appears. This video is an independent, transformative work created for review, criticism, commentary, educational, informational, and entertainment purposes. Any third-party content is used only to support original analysis and is not intended to replace or reproduce the original work. The Blind Side, released in 2009 and directed by John Lee Hancock, opens not with a football, but with a definition, a single word flashed on screen that most viewers forget by the time the film ends, even though it is the entire thesis of everything that follows. Before we ever meet Michael Oher as a character, we meet him as a statistic, a name on a list of displaced kids being shuffled through Memphis's public school system on a technicality, accepted into a private Christian academy less because anyone believes in him and more because a coach wants his frame on the football field. This is the first piece of psychology the film asks us to sit with, and it is uncomfortable on purpose. Michael is not being invited into a better life. He is being recruited as a body. Nobody in that opening act, not the administrators, not the coaches, not even his new classmates, is asking who Michael actually is. They are asking what he can do for them. That distinction matters more than it seems right now, because everything Leigh and Tuohy does later in this film only lands as powerful because of how sharply it contrasts with this opening indifference. The film is quietly building a trap for the audience here. We are meant to watch these early scenes and feel the same casual dismissal everyone else feels, the mild curiosity mixed with discomfort, the desire to help mixed with the desire to keep our distance. Hancock is not just introducing a character. He is implicating the viewer in the exact pattern of behavior the film is about to spend 2 hours dismantling. Watch how the camera frames Michael in these first minutes. Almost always positioned at the edge of the frame, slightly out of focus, physically present but socially invisible, a visual grammar that will not change until someone finally decides to look directly at him instead of around him. This is also where the film plants its first quiet open loop, one most casual viewers never consciously register. Michael carries almost nothing with him into this new world. No bag, no records, barely a change of clothes, and the film lingers just long enough on that emptiness for it to register as strange rather than sad. Hold on to that detail. The absence of belongings becomes one of the most important visual motifs in the entire film, because everything Michael eventually gains will be measured against how little he started with. The turning point of this section is deceptively small, and that is exactly why it works. Leigh and Tuohy does not save Michael with a grand gesture. She notices him walking alone in the cold on Thanksgiving night, wearing a t-shirt in freezing weather, heading toward the school gym because it is the only building he knows will be warm and unlocked. This is the moment the entire film pivots on, and it is worth asking what is actually happening psychologically in that car when she tells the driver to stop. On the surface, this looks like simple compassion, and most competing reviews stop right there. But look closer at how the film has built Leigh, and up to this point, she has already been established as someone who runs her household, her design business, and her social circle with total control, someone whose identity is built on being the person who notices what others miss and fixes what others ignore. Her decision to stop the car is not just kindness. It is consistent with who she has always been, a woman who cannot tolerate an unsolved problem sitting directly in front of her. This is not a story about a stranger discovering generosity for the first time. It is a story about a controlling, detail-obsessed woman finally encountering a problem large enough to match her will and choosing to solve it with her entire life instead of a single gesture. Michael, for his part, barely speaks in this scene, and that silence is doing enormous narrative work. He has learned, through years of being overlooked, that wanting too much invites disappointment, so he expects almost nothing. Watch his eyes instead of his words here. Every flicker of surprise on his face is the film quietly building the emotional foundation for everything that happens once he actually moves into that house. The first night at the Tuohy home is where the film does its most underrated character work, and it is almost entirely nonverbal. Michael is given a couch to sleep on, a temporary, tentative offer everyone in the room understands is really a test disguised as hospitality. What nobody says out loud, but what the staging makes unmistakable, is that this is the first time in years Michael has slept somewhere with a locked door between himself and the outside world, and the film lets that sit in silence rather than explaining it through dialogue. A weaker script script would have given Michael a monologue here. Hancock instead trusts the actor's stillness and the quiet of the house itself to carry the weight. Meanwhile, the Tuohy family undergoes its own quieter transformation the film almost hides in plain sight. Sean Tuohy, easygoing and business-minded, treats Michael's presence as a logistical matter to be managed, feeding him, giving him space, not yet emotionally invested. Leigh, by contrast, is already reorganizing her sense of who belongs to her family, faster than the rest of the household is prepared for. That gap between a family housing a stranger and a mother who has already, privately, decided he is her son, is the emotional engine of the next hour, and it is worth watching for the moments where the rest of the family catches up to a decision Leigh and made almost instantly. What most competitor coverage of this film misses entirely is how carefully the early classroom and hallway scenes at Wingate Christian School are constructed to show two different kinds of ignorance operating at once. There is the ignorance of students and faculty who assume Michael is intellectually limited because of how quietly he moves through the building, and there is a second, quieter ignorance belonging to the institution itself, which has no framework for understanding a student whose intelligence does not show up on standardized paperwork. The film uses one particular scene, a teacher reading Michael's old academic file aloud in a faculty meeting, laughing slightly at the string of failing grades, to expose how a system built around test scores can look directly at a person and still fail to see him. This is where the film's title starts to earn its double meaning. The blind side is not just the football term for the offensive tackle position protecting a quarterback from a hit he cannot see coming. It is every person in this film who fails to notice Michael's actual character because they are only looking at the version of him that fits their assumptions. Leigh-Ann's tutor, Miss Sue, is the first adult outside the family to challenge this pattern directly, discovering that Michael's testing reveals extraordinary strengths in protective instinct and spatial awareness, the cognitive profile of someone built to anticipate danger before it arrives. The film plants this detail early and deliberately because it will pay off twice, once on the football field and once, more quietly, in how Michael relates to every member of the Tuohy family. By the end of this first stretch, something has shifted that is easy to miss if you are only tracking plot. Michael has gone from a name on an admissions list to a fixed presence at the Tuohy dinner table, and the film marks this transition not through dialogue but through repetition. The same chair, the same seat, the same quiet routine night after night until the routine itself becomes proof of belonging. What is actually at risk here is not Michael's physical safety, already resolved by getting him off the street. It is something harder to name, whether a boy trained never to expect permanence will allow himself to believe this house is not temporary. Every guarded glance he gives the family is Michael running a private calculation, testing whether this kindness has a hidden cost, because every other kindness in his life has come with one. That question, whether this family is different or just another arrangement that will eventually end, is the real engine driving this story forward, far more than any football scholarship. Hold on to that tension, because the next stretch tests it directly, through a Thanksgiving dinner scene that reveals exactly how far Leigh-Ann is willing to go, and how much resistance she's about to face from someone who's supposed to be on her side. It is worth pausing here to name something the film never says outright, but structures every scene around, because it is the single most misread element of this story when people discuss it online. The dominant narrative repeated across most reviews frames this as a simple white savior story, one wealthy family rescuing one poor teenager, and stops there. That reading is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete. Leigh-Ann Tuohy is not written as a flawless hero. The film repeatedly shows her making decisions about Michael's life without fully consulting him, what school he attends, what activities he pursues, even who he's allowed to see, and lets those decisions sit uncomfortably rather than excusing them. This is a directorial choice, not an oversight. Hancock is quietly asking the audience to hold two truths at once: that Leigh-Ann's intervention almost certainly saves Michael's life, and that the way she exercises control over it says something complicated about power, class, and who gets to make decisions for whom. Very few videos covering this film sit with that tension for more than a sentence. The other underexplored thread here is Michael's own interiority, which the film deliberately withholds rather than over-explains. We never get a flashback dramatizing his past, only fragments referenced in dialogue. This mirrors Michael's own psychology, a young man who has survived by not dwelling on his past, because dwelling on it serves no protective function. Every choice in this opening act, his silence, his guardedness, his sudden willingness to physically shield people he barely knows, is building toward a single idea the film won't state directly until much later. That protection is the only language Michael has ever fully trusted, because it is the one thing nobody ever offered him first. first. Keep that in mind as we move into the Thanksgiving dinner sequence, which is about to complicate everything you think you understand about how welcome Michael actually is in this family. The Thanksgiving dinner sequence is the moment this film finally forces its central question into the open, and it does so through the person you would least expect to raise it. It is not a neighbor, not a teacher, not a stranger at the grocery store who challenges Leigh and about bringing Michael into her home. It is her own circle of friends, seated around a table, asking the question in the gentlest, most socially acceptable language available, wrapped in concern for her safety and her family's reputation. Watch how the film stages this scene. The camera keeps cutting back to Leigh's face rather than the friend speaking, because the actual drama here is not in the question being asked. It is in Leigh's real-time decision about whether to defend Michael publicly or let the moment pass quietly. She chooses the harder option. Her response, delivered without raising her voice, is one of the sharpest character beats in the entire film, because it reveals that her commitment to Michael is not private charity she performs quietly and denies when questioned. It is something she is now willing to defend socially, at cost to her own standing among people whose approval she has clearly built her identity around for years. This marks the exact moment Leigh stops being a woman doing a kind thing and becomes a woman who has publicly staked her reputation on a person nobody around that table believes deserves it. The film does not let this victory feel clean, either. Several of her friends visibly recoil, and one delivers a line dripping with condescension disguised as concern, the kind of comment that reveals more about the speaker's assumptions than about Michael himself. This is the film quietly indicting an entire social class, the well-meaning country club world Leigh belongs to, showing how casually prejudice can hide behind politeness when it never has to actually confront its own consequences. Notice too how Michael is not physically present for most of this exchange. He is elsewhere in the house, unaware his entire future is being negotiated in a room he cannot see into, which mirrors the exact blindness the film's title keeps returning to. Oher-Tuohy, the youngest member of the family, becomes the emotional bridge of this section, and his role deserves far more analytical attention than most reviews give it. Where the adults navigate Michael's presence through frameworks of guilt, charity, social risk, and legal complication, Oher approaches him with none of that baggage. He simply wants a friend, and he treats Michael's size and strength not as something to be managed, but as something genuinely exciting, a walking action figure who happens to also be kind to him. This matters more than it appears to, because Oher becomes the first person in the film to relate to Michael without any trace of pity. Pity has defined nearly every interaction Michael has had with adults up to this point, wrapped in different disguises: concern, charity, curiosity, but pity nonetheless, always positioning Michael as the object of someone else's feelings rather than a full person with his own interior life. Oher's friendship strips all of that away. He does not see a boy who needs saving. He sees the coolest person he has ever met, and he says so, loudly, repeatedly, without any of the careful diplomatic hedging the adults deploy. Watch how Michael's body language changes specifically in scenes with Oher. His shoulders drop, his face softens in a way it does not around Leigh and around Sean, even around Collins in these early stretches. This is the film using physical performance to show us something the dialogue never states directly, that Michael feels most human, most unguarded, in the presence of the one person who has never once treated him as a project. Collins-Tuohy's arc across this stretch deserves a more careful reading than the surface-level discomfort most reviews reduce it to. Early on, Collins is visibly uneasy sharing her home, her school, and her social world with Michael, and it would be easy and lazy to read this simply as a teenage girl being shallow. But look at what the film actually shows. Collins is a popular, socially visible student at a school where reputation functions as its own currency, and Michael's arrival threatens to disrupt the carefully maintained social order she has spent years building. Her discomfort is not really about Michael as a person. It's about what his presence signals to her peer group, and about her own fear of losing status. This is a more honest and interesting psychological read than simple prejudice, because it implicates the social ecosystem of the school itself rather than positioning Collins as uniquely flawed. What makes her arc effective is how gradually the film earns her shift. There is no single dramatic scene where Collins suddenly embraces Michael. Instead, small accumulating moments, a shared car ride, a hallway interaction where she chooses to acknowledge him publicly, a subtle willingness to be seen next to him at school events. Each moment costs her something socially, and the film understands that this cost is precisely what makes her eventual acceptance meaningful rather than automatic. A weaker script would have made Collins instantly welcoming, sacrificing psychological realism for a cleaner arc. This film trusts that real change is usually slow, uncomfortable, and socially expensive. The legal guardianship sequence that follows is where the film shifts from emotional commitment to formal commitment, and the distinction matters more than it initially appears to. Up to this point, Michael's place in the household has existed in a kind of protective limbo, real in feeling but fragile in structure. The scene where Leigh pursues guardianship is the film's way of closing that vulnerability, converting an emotional bond into something the outside world is finally forced to recognize. What's easy to miss is how the film frames this primarily through Michael's reaction rather than Leigh's initiative. He is asked, almost in passing, whether he wants to be a Tuohy, and the moment the film lingers on is not the paperwork, but Michael's brief, almost disbelieving pause before he answers. That pause is doing enormous psychological work. The sound of a young man recalibrating years of learned expectation in real time, testing whether this offer is actually going to hold. This is also the moment the film most directly answers its own open question from earlier, whether Michael will ever let himself believe this family is permanent. His answer is quiet, understated, almost anticlimactic in its delivery, and that restraint is deliberate, refusing to betray the emotional register the character has consistently held, a young man who processes everything internally before he lets it show. Running parallel to all of this is Michael's slow, uneven academic transformation under Miss Sue's tutoring, a thread the film handles with more nuance than most sports dramas typically allow. Rather than presenting his academic struggles as simple lack of intelligence, the film frames them as a mismatch between how Michael naturally processes the world and how classroom instruction demands information be received. His protective instincts, his spatial reasoning, his ability to read physical situations and anticipate danger. These are treated as a form of intelligence just as legitimate as anything measured by a standardized test. The breakthrough moment, when Miss Sue reframes a football blocking assignment in terms of protecting family, using Leigh and SJ and the rest of the household as stand-ins for the players Michael needs to defend, is one of the smartest pieces of writing in the film because it finds the specific emotional language that actually reaches him: protection, loyalty, family. This is the film's clearest articulation yet of its thesis, that intelligence and worth were never Michael's problem, visibility and translation were. It is worth stepping back to examine what the film is doing with Oher-Tuohy, frequently dismissed by casual viewers as comic relief. That reading undersells him. Sean's contribution is quieter but structurally important. He is the steady counterweight who repeatedly asks the practical questions nobody else wants to ask out loud. What happens to Michael's eligibility? What the NCAA will say? How this looks from the outside? A weaker film would have made this skepticism antagonistic. Instead, the film treats his caution as love expressed through pragmatism, which becomes especially important later when outside institutions begin questioning the family's motives directly, because Sean's early diligence is what protects Michael from accusations that could have unraveled the entire arrangement. This connects to something almost no other coverage of this film addresses. The story is quietly building toward an institutional conflict long before the NCAA investigation ever appears on screen. Performance-wise, this stretch deserves specific credit. Sandra Bullock's work earns its later awards recognition through restraint, not volume. The country club rebuke delivered without raising her voice, her face barely moving when Michael answers the guardianship question. Quinton Aaron's performance is doing something even harder, communicating a rich inner life almost entirely through stillness, making his silences read as full rather than empty. Hold on to one detail moving forward: the growing tension between Michael's academic standing and the NCAA scrutiny of how a homeless teenager ended up starting for one of the state's top football programs while living with a wealthy family. That tension is about to move from subtext directly into the film's central conflict. There is also a thematic thread worth naming, because it's the connective tissue that separates a review from genuine analysis. Every relationship Michael builds here, with SJ, with Collins, with Sean, with Miss Sue, is a variation on the same underlying question: will he be seen as permanent or as a guest whose welcome could be revoked? SJ answers with uncomplicated loyalty. Collins answers slowly, through accumulated small costs. Sean answers through protective diligence disguised as caution. Miss Sue answers by refusing to accept the school's existing framework for measuring Michael's worth. For people, for emotional languages, converging on the same conclusion Leigh reached instantly the night she stopped the car. This is where The Blind Side distinguishes itself from similarly structured sports dramas of the same era, films that compress this kind of relational trust building into a single training montage. This film spends real, patient screen time on the people around its protagonist, which is precisely why the eventual football success lands as earned rather than inevitable. Keep this ensemble structure in mind, because the next stretch tests every one of these bonds simultaneously, under far more public and adversarial pressure than anything this family has faced so far. The football sequences that open this stretch of the film are where a lot of competing reviews go shallow, treating Michael's on-field emergence as a straightforward athletic underdog story. The same beats you've seen in 100 other sports movies: a slow start, a moment of doubt, a triumphant breakthrough set to swelling music. That reading is not incorrect so much as it is lazy, because it ignores what the film is doing with the specific position Michael plays, and why that choice is thematically inseparable from everything the story has built to this point. Michael is not simply a talented athlete discovering his gifts. He is a left tackle, a position whose entire function is invisible to a casual audience, whose success is measured by absence rather than presence, by the hits that never land on the quarterback rather than the plays that show up on a highlight reel. This is not incidental to the story. It is the film's entire argument made literal on a football field. For his whole life, Michael's greatest strength, his instinct to protect the people around him without asking for recognition, has gone unnoticed and unrewarded, precisely because it does not announce itself the way scoring a touchdown does. Watch how differently the film shoots Michael's early practices compared to his eventual on-field success once he understands what he is actually being asked to do. In the early scenes, he is tentative, almost apologetic in his physicality, holding back a strength that clearly unsettles him, because he has spent years being taught, implicitly, that his size makes people afraid of him rather than grateful for him. The shift is not a triumphant montage. It is Miss Sue's blocking lesson finally clicking on the field, Michael reframing an opposing player not as an obstacle to dominate, but as a threat to a person he loves, and the film lets us watch that internal translation happen almost in real time on his face before it shows up in his physical performance. The coach's relationship with Michael deserves closer attention than most reviews give it, because it represents one of the film's more understated critiques, aimed not at any individual villain, but at an entire institutional culture that measures a young man's worth purely in terms of athletic output. Early on, the coach's primary interest in Michael is transactional, a talented body that could transform a struggling program, and the film does not soften this, showing his frustration boiling over during Michael's tentative early performances, frustration that has nothing to do with concern for Michael as a person. This is deliberately uncomfortable to watch, because it forces the audience to recognize a version of the exact same dynamic that defined Michael's life before the Tuohys. What makes this section interesting is that it doesn't resolve this tension through a dramatic coaching awakening. Instead, Leigh intervenes directly, walking onto the practice field and recalibrating the coach's entire approach, translating football strategy into the language of family protection that actually reaches Michael. This reveals something about Leigh's role in the story more broadly. She is functioning, again and again, as a translator between Michael and every institution that has failed to understand him: the school, the football program, eventually the NCAA itself. The film is quietly arguing something about advocacy, about how systems built around narrow definitions of merit routinely fail people who don't fit their categories, and about how those systems only change when someone with enough social capital is willing to spend it forcing that change. A less comfortable reading of the film's inspirational surface than it first appears. The NCAA investigation that follows is where the film's central tension, quietly seeded through Sean's careful questions and Miss Sue's meticulous documentation, finally erupts into open conflict. And it's worth examining exactly what accusation is being leveled, because the film handles this with more nuance than it initially appears to. The investigator's suspicion is not baseless paranoia. It's a reasonable institutional response to a genuinely unusual set of circumstances: a wealthy family with strong ties to Ole Miss taking in a homeless, highly recruited athlete and steering him toward their alma mater. The film does not pretend this pattern doesn't match what recruiting violations typically look like. Instead, it forces the audience to sit inside the space between two competing truths: that the scrutiny is procedurally justified given the pattern, and that in this specific case, the relationship it's investigating was never actually about recruiting at all. This is more sophisticated than simply casting the NCAA as a faceless antagonist, because it refuses to let the audience dismiss the investigation as pure overreach, instead asking whether an institution built to prevent exploitation can actually tell the difference between exploitation and genuine, complicated love. Michael's reaction here is the emotional center of this section. For the first time since moving in, he's confronted with the possibility that his place in this family might be conditional, threatening the exact fear the film has been building since its earliest scenes. Watch how he physically withdraws, quieter, more guarded, reverting to patterns of self-protection the film had seemed to suggest he was moving past. This regression is not a screenwriting inconsistency. It's psychologically precise. Trust built over months doesn't simply overwrite years of learned self-protection the first time it's tested by real external threat. This is also the point where the emotional breather becomes structurally necessary, and Hancock earns it by slowing everything down rather than escalating into another confrontation. After the investigation's tension peaks, the film shifts into a quieter register, a scene of Michael and Leigh and simply sitting together, not discussing the investigation directly, not resolving anything with dialogue, just occupying the same space in a way that communicates far more than words could at this point. This is where the film's restraint pays its largest dividend. A less confident script would have used this moment for a big speech. Instead, the scene trusts silence, trusts the accumulated weight of everything the audience has already watched these two people build together. Notice the sentence rhythm the film uses here: long, unhurried, almost meditative, a sharp contrast to the clipped urgency of the investigation scenes preceding it. When the investigation eventually resolves, handled with appropriate brevity rather than dwelling on legal procedure, the emotional payoff lands specifically because of the quiet groundwork laid in this breather. The relief the audience feels is not relief that a plot obstacle has cleared. It's relief that this specific relationship, tested under real pressure for the first time, held. Oher-Tuohy's earlier diligence around Michael's paperwork and eligibility, which seemed like a minor beat when it first appeared, now pays off directly, and it's worth appreciating how carefully the film planted this setup without calling attention to it at the time. The documentation Sean insisted on maintaining becomes the exact evidence that protects Michael and the family once the investigation concludes. A small but meaningful example of the film rewarding careful, unglamorous diligence over dramatic gesture, reinforcing that his particular form of love, practical and unshowy, is not lesser than Leigh and's more visible, decisive form of love. The broader thematic weight of this investigation sequence becomes clear once it resolves, forcing every character, and by extension the audience, to confront directly what the film has only implied: that doing right by a person society has trained itself to overlook will often be misread and scrutinized by systems that can't easily distinguish genuine care from exploitation. The film resolves this not by suggesting the scrutiny was wrong, but by showing the relationship was strong enough to survive being tested, a more mature resolution than a simpler film would have attempted. As this stretch closes, Michael's football career accelerates in earnest, and the film finally allows the triumphant on-field sequence it withheld earlier. But even here it refuses to abandon the psychological groundwork it spent this section building. Watch how the film frames his decisive on-field moments, not as individual glory, but consistently in relation to the people he's protecting, cutting between his physical dominance and quick, almost subliminal flashes of Leigh and SJ, the family that gave him a reason to want to be good at something for the first time. College recruiters begin taking serious notice during this stretch, and the film uses their attention as a bridge into the tension defining the next section. The pressure Michael will face over where to commit, and whether his choice will be read as genuinely his own or as evidence that the family's earlier generosity always had strings attached. This is where the story finally has to answer the question it's been circling since the first scene. Does Michael Oher get to choose his own future, or is that choice, like so much else in his life, made for him by people who believe they know what's best? It's worth pausing on the craft choices underneath this stretch, because they rarely get named with specificity in surrounding commentary, which defaults to vague praise about the film being inspiring without identifying what's actually generating that feeling technically. The cinematography during practice and game sequences is quietly disciplined. Rather than the kinetic, hyper-edited style common to modern sports films, this film keeps its camera comparatively still during Michael's key moments of realization, letting the audience watch a single unbroken beat of understanding cross his face rather than cutting to reaction shots or slow motion. This restraint is a directorial argument in itself, a refusal to let spectacle substitute for character. The score functions the same way. Composer Carter Burwell resists swelling dramatically under every emotional beat, and the moments where the music does rise retain their impact because they're used sparingly. Notice how quiet the score is during the NCAA investigation scenes, almost absent, forcing the tension to live entirely in dialogue and performance. Comparatively, it's worth placing this film briefly alongside other sports-adjacent biographical dramas from the same period, because the comparison sharpens what makes its approach distinct. Films like Remember the Titans or We Are Marshall use team dynamics and collective triumph as their emotional engine. The Blind Side narrows its focus instead, treating football success as a byproduct of a single relationship rather than the goal itself, which explains why so much of the runtime is spent in living rooms, kitchens, and cars rather than locker rooms and stadiums. That distinction is the clearest answer to the positioning question this script has been building toward since the opening hook. Why this version deserves attention when dozens of other reviews already cover the same film. Most coverage treats the football as the story and the family as backdrop. This analysis has argued the relationship is the actual story, and the football is simply where it gets tested publicly. One more thread before this section closes, because it connects directly to what's coming. Michael's growing football success is attracting attention fundamentally different from anything he's experienced. Attention rooted entirely in what he can produce on a field, stripped of the relational context that's defined every meaningful connection he's built since arriving at the Tuohy house. College recruiters don't know about the couch he slept on his first night, or the guardianship conversation, or the quiet way SJ made him feel human. They know his measurements, his game film, his recruiting ranking. This creates a dramatic irony the film sets up without stating directly. The audience knows Michael as a fully realized person shaped by specific relationships, while an external apparatus is about to treat him once again as a body to be acquired, echoing exactly the dynamic the film opened with at Wingate. Hold on to that question, because it becomes the central conflict of the next stretch, when the pressure to choose a school collides with the family's deep, public ties to one particular university, and the outside world's narrative about Michael's choice becomes a referendum on whether anything in his life since that first Thanksgiving night has ever really been his own decision. The recruiting sequence that follows delivers the film's most direct confrontation with the question it has been circling since the opening scene, and it does so through a single, quietly devastating conversation that most casual coverage of this film reduces to a minor plot beat rather than recognizing it as the emotional climax of Michael's entire arc. As college programs intensify their pursuit, the obvious assumption forming around Michael, inside the film and among viewers watching it, is that he will commit to Ole Miss, the school the Tuohys have supported for generations, the school Sean played basketball for, the school woven into the fabric of this family's identity long before Michael ever arrived at their door. The film understands exactly how loaded this assumption is, and rather than letting it pass unexamined, it stages a scene where an NCAA compliance officer asks Michael directly, without any family member present to soften or steer the conversation, why he actually wants to attend Ole Mississippi. This is the single most important question the film asks in its entire runtime, because it is not really about football at all. It is asking whether Michael has ever, in his entire relationship with this family, been given the space to want something purely for himself. Michael's answer, when it finally comes, reframes everything the audience has watched up to this point. He does not cite football tradition or family loyalty as his primary reason. As this stretch closes, Michael's football career accelerates in earnest, and the film finally allows the triumphant on-field sequence it withheld earlier. But even here it refuses to abandon the psychological groundwork it spent this section building. Watch how the film frames his decisive on-field moments, not as individual glory, but consistently in relation to the people he's protecting, cutting between his physical dominance and quick, almost subliminal flashes of Leigh and SJ, the family that gave him a reason to want to be good at something for the first time. College recruiters begin taking serious notice during this stretch, and the film uses their attention as a bridge into the tension defining the next section. The pressure Michael will face over where to commit, and whether his choice will be read as genuinely his own or as evidence that the family's earlier generosity always had strings attached. This is where the story finally has to answer the question it's been circling since the first scene. Does Michael Oher get to choose his own future, or is that choice, like so much else in his life, made for him by people who believe they know what's best? It's worth pausing on the craft choices underneath this stretch, because they rarely get named with specificity in surrounding commentary, which defaults to vague praise about the film being inspiring without identifying what's actually generating that feeling technically. The cinematography during practice and game sequences is quietly disciplined. Rather than the kinetic, hyper-edited style common to modern sports films, this film keeps its camera comparatively still during Michael's key moments of realization, letting the audience watch a single unbroken beat of understanding cross his face rather than cutting to reaction shots or slow motion. This restraint is a directorial argument in itself, a refusal to let spectacle substitute for character. The score functions the same way. Composer Carter Burwell resists swelling dramatically under every emotional beat, and the moments where the music does rise retain their impact because they're used sparingly. Notice how quiet the score is during the NCAA investigation scenes, almost absent, forcing the tension to live entirely in dialogue and performance. Comparatively, it's worth placing this film briefly alongside other sports-adjacent biographical dramas from the same period, because the comparison sharpens what makes its approach distinct. Films like Remember the Titans or We Are Marshall use team dynamics and collective triumph as their emotional engine. The Blind Side narrows its focus instead, treating football success as a byproduct of a single relationship rather than the goal itself, which explains why so much of the runtime is spent in living rooms, kitchens, and cars rather than locker rooms and stadiums. That distinction is the clearest answer to the positioning question this script has been building toward since the opening hook. Why this version deserves attention when dozens of other reviews already cover the same film. Most coverage treats the football as the story and the family as backdrop. This analysis has argued the relationship is the actual story, and the football is simply where it gets tested publicly. One more thread before this section closes, because it connects directly to what's coming. Michael's growing football success is attracting attention fundamentally different from anything he's experienced. Attention rooted entirely in what he can produce on a field, stripped of the relational context that's defined every meaningful connection he's built since arriving at the Tuohy house. College recruiters don't know about the couch he slept on his first night, or the guardianship conversation, or the quiet way SJ made him feel human. They know his measurements, his game film, his recruiting ranking. This creates a dramatic irony the film sets up without stating directly. The audience knows Michael as a fully realized person shaped by specific relationships, while an external apparatus is about to treat him once again as a body to be acquired, echoing exactly the dynamic the film opened with at Wingate. Hold on to that question, because it becomes the central conflict of the next stretch, when the pressure to choose a school collides with the family's deep, public ties to one particular university, and the outside world's narrative about Michael's choice becomes a referendum on whether anything in his life since that first Thanksgiving night has ever really been his own decision. The recruiting sequence that follows delivers the film's most direct confrontation with the question it has been circling since the opening scene, and it does so through a single, quietly devastating conversation that most casual coverage of this film reduces to a minor plot beat rather than recognizing it as the emotional climax of Michael's entire arc. As college programs intensify their pursuit, the obvious assumption forming around Michael, inside the film and among viewers watching it, is that he will commit to Ole Miss, the school the Tuohys have supported for generations, the school Sean played basketball for, the school woven into the fabric of this family's identity long before Michael ever arrived at their door. The film understands exactly how loaded this assumption is, and rather than letting it pass unexamined, it stages a scene where an NCAA compliance officer asks Michael directly, without any family member present to soften or steer the conversation, why he actually wants to attend Ole Mississippi. This is the single most important question the film asks in its entire runtime, because it is not really about football at all. It is asking whether Michael has ever, in his entire relationship with this family, been given the space to want something purely for himself. Michael's answer, when it finally comes, reframes everything the audience has watched up to this point. He does not cite football tradition or family loyalty as his primary reason. He explains, haltingly, that Ole Miss is simply the place his family already is, Leigh and Sean, SJ, Collins, and that going anywhere else would mean starting over, alone, in a way he has already done too many times in his life to want to do it again voluntarily. This is not a young man being told what to choose. It is a young man for whom the definition of home has become so specific and so hard one that leaving it, even for elite football opportunities elsewhere, is simply not a real option in his own mind. The film resolves its central tension not by proving the choice was entirely independent of family influence, an impossible standard for any teenager raised inside a loving household, but by proving the choice was genuinely his, rooted in his own understanding of what he actually values. This scene deserves closer scrutiny than most reviews give it, because the compliance officer's skepticism is not a narrative obstacle to be dismissed. It's doing real thematic work connecting back to everything the film has built around institutional distrust of Michael's story. Notice how the officer's questions mirror almost exactly the questions a skeptical viewer might be asking at this point. Is this a genuine relationship or an engineered outcome? Is Michael actually choosing this, or simply repeating what he's been conditioned to say? The film does not treat this skepticism as unreasonable or cynical. It treats it as a legitimate question that deserves a real answer, and it trusts Michael's own voice, delivered without polish, without rehearsal, without a parent standing beside him coaching his response. response, to provide that answer more convincingly than any external assurance from the family ever could. This is a crucial distinction the film is making about autonomy and influence, that being shaped by the people who love you is not the same thing as being controlled by them, and that the test of genuine choice is not whether outside influence exists, because it always does for every person raised inside any family, but whether the person making the choice can articulate their own reasoning in their own words when directly and unexpectedly asked to. Michael passes that test here, not with confidence or eloquence, but with the same halting honesty that has defined his character throughout the entire film. Once Michael's commitment to Ole Miss is settled, the film moves swiftly through the remaining beats of his football career, and this pacing choice is worth noting because it reveals something about what the story actually considers its climax. A weaker film, more interested in football as spectacle than as metaphor, would have spent significant runtime on Michael's collegiate career and his eventual NFL draft selection, the external validation of scouts confirming what the audience already knows. This film instead compresses that entire arc into a brief closing sequence, because by this point the story has already delivered its actual emotional payoff, the answer to whether Michael would ever be permitted to choose his own path. Everything after that is, narratively speaking, denouement rather than climax. The closing text before the credits, informing the audience of Michael's actual NFL draft position and subsequent career, functions less as triumphant epilogue and more as quiet confirmation, a factual coda reassuring the audience that the emotional resolution they just watched translated into a genuinely successful outward life. This is a specific storytelling choice, prioritizing emotional truth over biographical completeness, that distinguishes this film from more conventional sports biopics. Here is where this analysis needs to depart from a pure film breakdown and address something almost no competing review from the film's original release window could have addressed, because it hadn't happened yet. In August of 2023, Michael Oher filed a legal petition in a Tennessee probate court against John and Leigh Oher-Tuohy, alleging that what he had believed for nearly 2 decades to be a legal adoption was in fact a conservatorship, a legal arrangement he claimed had allowed the family to profit from his name and life story without his informed consent. According to court filings and reporting at the time, Oher stated he only discovered the actual legal nature of the arrangement in early 2023, and his petition sought both termination of the conservatorship and a full accounting of money earned from the film and related coverage of his story. The Tuohys, through their attorneys, disputed the characterization that they had profited unfairly, stating Oher received the same share of proceeds as other members of the household. In September of 2023, a Tennessee judge terminated the conservatorship, though the broader financial dispute continued in the courts before ultimately concluding through a confidential settlement, the details of which have not been fully disclosed publicly. This information does not exist to render a verdict on either party's character, and this analysis is not positioned to do so responsibly given the limited and contested nature of what has been made public. What it does is retroactively complicate the exact thematic question this film spent its entire runtime building toward: whether the systems and relationships around Michael ever fully allowed him ownership of his own story. This context matters because of how precisely it collides with the movie's own thematic architecture. Remember the recurring motif this analysis has traced from the opening scene onward: Michael's story being defined and narrated by institutions and individuals who claim to have his best interests at heart. The school treating him as a body, the football program treating him as a talent, the NCAA treating him as a compliance risk, and Leigh and, repeatedly, positioned as the one person cutting through all of that to actually see him as a person. The 2023 legal filing complicates that framing in a way the film itself could never have anticipated, raising the uncomfortable possibility that the relationship the movie presents as the clearest counterexample to institutional exploitation may have itself involved a legal structure Oher says he did not fully understand at the time he entered it. This does not retroactively invalidate the emotional truth of the relationships depicted in the film. Family bonds are rarely reducible to the legal paperwork that formalizes them, and genuine affection and disputed financial arrangements can coexist. But it does mean an honest analysis of this film today has to hold two things simultaneously the film never had to reconcile: the moving, well-constructed story it tells on screen, and the more complicated reality that has since emerged around the people that story was based on. It's worth stepping back to consider how the film's actual cultural reception compares to the story it tells about itself. The Blind Side was a genuine box office phenomenon, eventually earning over $300 million worldwide against a modest production budget. Sandra Bullock's performance earned the the Academy Award for Best Actress, and the film received a Best Picture nomination, an unusual combination of populist commercial success and formal industry recognition. Critical reception at the time was more divided than the award's recognition suggests, with a meaningful portion of critics raising exactly the concerns this analysis has surfaced. Questions about whose story this actually is, whether Michael's own interiority receives sufficient weight relative to Leigh-Ann's, and whether the film's framing drifts toward positioning a wealthy family as the primary agents of change in a story that is, at its core, about a young man's life and autonomy. These are not new criticisms invented by hindsight. They existed in real time, alongside the film's commercial and award success. This is also a useful moment to address why examining both the film's craft and its complicated real-world afterlife matters more now than it would have at the time of release. A review made in 2009 simply did not have access to information that reframes how an audience today can responsibly engage with this material. This doesn't mean the film should be dismissed or its craft go unrecognized. The performances, the directorial restraint, the careful pacing this analysis has traced are real, considerable achievements regardless of what's happened outside the frame since. But a genuinely thorough analysis now has an obligation earlier coverage didn't, holding the film's artistic accomplishment and its ethically complicated subject matter in the same frame without collapsing one into the other. There's also something worth naming about the audience relationship to this kind of revelation more broadly. Stories marketed as based on true events carry an implicit promise that the emotional truth being sold is grounded in something more solid than invention. And when new information complicates that promise, audiences often experience something closer to a small personal betrayal than a simple factual update. That reaction is worth taking seriously. At the same time, it's worth resisting the temptation to swing entirely the other direction, treating the legal controversy as proof everything depicted was manufactured. The available public record suggests a relationship that was, by most accounts, genuinely affectionate and significant for years, existing alongside a financial arrangement Oher says he did not fully understand and later came to view as exploitative. Both things can be true simultaneously, and resisting the pull toward a single, tidy conclusion is precisely the intellectual honesty this analysis has tried to model, rather than defaulting to either uncritical praise or reflexive cynicism. As this section closes, hold on to the through line this analysis has been building since the opening hook. Who gets to see a person clearly, and who gets to control how that person's story is told once it becomes valuable to someone else? The film answers this one way inside its own narrative frame, showing Leigh-Ann's clear-eyed refusal to look past Michael when everyone around her did. The real-world context surrounding the film's production and legacy answers a related but distinct version of that same question with considerably more ambiguity. Keep both versions active as we move into the final stretch, where the film's ending, its thematic statements, and its ultimate verdict all have to be evaluated with this fuller picture in view. Before moving forward with the story, it is worth stepping back to examine the thematic architecture this film has been quietly constructing beneath its surface, because most reviews treat The Blind Side as a simple story about kindness when it is actually engaged in a much sharper argument about American meritocracy and who gets access to it. The film's entire premise rests on an uncomfortable truth that it never states directly but consistently demonstrates through its structure, that intelligence, character, and potential exist independently of circumstance, but recognition of those qualities almost never does. Michael possessed the same protective instincts, the same spatial reasoning, the same fundamental decency before he ever met the Tuohys that he possesses afterward. What changed was not who he was. What changed was who was paying attention, and more specifically, who had the resources and social standing to translate what they saw into material opportunity. This is a genuinely uncomfortable thesis for a mainstream, crowd-pleasing film to be quietly advancing, because it suggests that merit alone is insufficient in a system that requires an advocate with capital, whether financial, social, or institutional, to unlock it. The film does not resolve this discomfort. It simply presents it and lets the audience sit with the implication that for every Michael Oher who happens to cross paths with a Leigh-Tuohy, there are countless others whose talents remain permanently unrecognized because no one with sufficient standing ever stopped their car. This is worth naming explicitly, because very few pieces of coverage on this film engage with its class politics directly, preferring to discuss it purely as an inspirational family drama. And that omission flattens what is actually one of the more quietly radical undercurrents running through an otherwise mainstream studio production. It is also worth examining how the film handles its source material, because the adaptation choices Hancock and his collaborators collaborators made when translating Michael Lewis's original book reveal a great deal about what kind of story this film ultimately decided to tell. Lewis's book is substantially broader in scope than the film, spending considerable time on the historical evolution of the left tackle position in professional football, tracing how a series of specific hits and injuries to star quarterbacks fundamentally reshaped how offensive lines were valued and compensated across the league. The film strips almost all of this structural football history away, keeping only what is necessary to make Michael's position thematically legible, and this compression is a meaningful creative choice rather than a simple runtime concession. By removing the broader historical context, the film narrows its focus entirely onto the family drama, sacrificing some of the book's intellectual scope in exchange for emotional intimacy. This is a trade worth naming rather than assuming, because it means the film is a genuinely different creative work from its source material rather than a straightforward visual translation of it, prioritizing relationship over research, feeling over statistics. Readers of the book often note that Michael himself receives considerably more interiority on the page than he does on screen, partly because prose allows access to internal thought that film generally has to communicate through performance and blocking instead. This is not necessarily a flaw in the adaptation, given how effectively Quinton physical performance compensates for that lost interiority, but it does mean viewers seeking a fuller picture of Michael's own perspective on these events are better served supplementing the film with the book, or better still, with Michael Oher's own memoir, which offers a version of this story told entirely in his own voice rather than filtered through Leigh's perspective, the lens the film itself largely adopts. Returning to the film's visual language, the title itself deserves one more layer of examination before this analysis moves toward its closing sections, because the phrase carries a third meaning beyond the two this analysis has already traced: the football position and the social invisibility Michael experiences before the Tuohys. The blind side, in a more literal sense, refers to whatever a person cannot see coming, and the film applies this idea to nearly every major character at some point in the story, not just Michael. Leigh has her own blind side, the assumption, however unconscious, that her own control and decisiveness are always benevolent, an assumption the film gently questions through the discomfort of scenes where Michael's own preferences get overridden by her certainty about what is best for him. Sean has a blind side around institutional risk, initially underestimating how seriously the NSA would scrutinize his family's situation. Collins has a blind side around her own social conditioning, not recognizing until later how much her early discomfort with Michael was shaped by peer pressure rather than genuine personal judgment. Even the film itself arguably has a blind side, a limited ability to fully interrogate the power dynamics inherent in a wealthy family unilaterally reshaping a teenager's entire life trajectory, even with the best of intentions. This layered use of a single title phrase across multiple characters, and even the film's own narrative perspective, is a more sophisticated piece of screenwriting than the film typically receives credit for. It is worth pausing here to ask a genuinely open question rather than simply asserting an answer, because this is exactly the kind of moment built for audience reflection rather than passive consumption. Given everything this analysis has traced about Leigh's controlling tendencies, her pattern of making major decisions about Michael's life without always consulting him first, would you consider her approach to helping Michael to be the right one, or would you have wanted to see more deference to his own voice earlier in the story? There is no obviously correct answer here, and reasonable viewers land in different places depending on how they weigh decisive intervention against individual autonomy, especially when the person being helped is a minor without stable housing or institutional support of his own. Some viewers read Leigh's certainty as exactly what a scared, exhausted teenager needed, someone willing to make hard calls so he did not have to navigate an overwhelming system entirely alone. Others read the same certainty as a pattern worth scrutinizing more critically, a wealthy woman accustomed to getting her way applying that same instinct to a young man's entire future without always pausing to ask what he actually wanted. Both readings are genuinely defensible based on what the film shows us. Turning back to character psychology, Leigh's own arc across the full runtime of this film deserves more careful tracing than most reviews attempt, because she is not actually static across the story despite appearing fully formed and decisive from her earliest scenes. What shifts in her is not her core personality. She remains controlling, decisive, and blunt throughout, but rather what she is willing to risk in service of that personality. Early in the film, her decisiveness operates within safe boundaries: her home, her business, her social circle, spaces where she already holds unquestioned authority. Her decision to bring Michael Michael in is the first time in the story we see her decisiveness extend into genuinely uncertain territory, an area where her usual social capital does not guarantee a positive outcome, and where she faces real, meaningful resistance from people whose approval has clearly mattered to her for years. Each subsequent decision, the guardianship, the public defense at the country club, the pursuit of an equitable outcome during the NCAA investigation, pushes that same core personality trait further outside her established comfort zone. This is a subtler character arc than films typically receive credit for, growth measured not by a change in fundamental personality, but by an expansion of the terrain that personality is willing to operate within, risking more publicly the deeper her commitment to Michael becomes. It is worth revisiting the emotional low point of this story now with the fuller context this analysis has built, because the NCAA investigation functions as this film's version of the all-is-lost moment that nearly every well-constructed narrative requires somewhere in its structure. This is not simply a plot complication to be resolved through legal maneuvering. It is the moment the story's entire emotional premise comes under direct threat. The possibility that everything Michael has built with this family could be reframed by people with real institutional power as something transactional and exploitative rather than genuine. For a character whose entire psychology has been built around distrust of permanence, this investigation represents his deepest fear given external, institutional legitimacy for the first time. It is not merely that Michael might lose his football eligibility. It is that the very story he has begun to believe about his own worth, that he is loved for who he is rather than valued for what he produces, is being publicly questioned by an authority whose skepticism the film has already established as procedurally reasonable rather than obviously wrong. The eventual resolution matters less as a legal outcome and more as proof that the relationship could survive having its deepest fear tested directly and publicly. Several open loops planted earlier in this analysis deserve closure now before this section ends, because a well-constructed piece of long-form commentary should honor the same structural discipline it is praising in the film itself. The absence of belongings this analysis flagged in the opening minutes of the story pays off precisely in the guardianship and recruiting sequences, where Michael, once defined entirely by what he lacked, is now the subject of active pursuit by universities and eventually professional scouts. The tension flagged around Sean's seemingly minor questions about eligibility and documentation pays off directly in the investigation sequence, where his early diligence becomes the specific evidence that protects the family. The dramatic irony this analysis named around college recruiters knowing only Michael's measurements and game film, stripped of everything the audience knows about his interior life, pays off in the Ole Miss commitment scene, where Michael's own halting explanation finally supplies the missing context those recruiters never had access to. Closing these loops deliberately reinforces one of this analysis's central arguments, that this film's screenplay is considerably more disciplined and interconnected than its inspirational marketing suggests. As this stretch of the analysis closes, it is worth naming plainly where the story stands and where it still needs to go. Michael has secured a stable home, a functioning family, athletic success, and a resolved legal status. The investigation has ended. His choice of college has been affirmed as genuinely his own. What remains is the film's final movement toward its actual conclusion, the moment where Michael leaves for college, the moment the Tuohy family has to reckon with what letting him go actually means after everything they have built together, and the epilogue that positions his real-world football career as the material confirmation of everything this story has argued about: talent, visibility, and belated recognition. This is also where the analysis itself has to begin shifting registers, from tracing plot and psychology scene by scene toward delivering the kind of interpretive synthesis an ending sequence demands. It is worth giving Miss Sue more direct attention before this section closes, because her function in the story extends well beyond simple tutor, and most reviews reduce her to a minor supporting figure rather than recognizing how central she actually is to the film's thesis about translation and recognition. Every major institutional failure this film identifies, the school that cannot see Michael's intelligence, the football program that only values his body, the family that initially struggles to communicate with him effectively, gets resolved through the same basic mechanism: someone finding the specific language that actually reaches him rather than expecting him to adapt to an existing framework built without him in mind. Miss Sue is the character who models this most explicitly and most literally. She does not simplify the curriculum for Michael, and the film is careful never to suggest that his struggles stem from lower intelligence requiring easier material. Instead, she does the harder work of translation, taking existing academic material and reframing it entirely through concepts Michael already understands deeply: protection, loyalty, spatial awareness, physical instinct. This approach reflects a specific and genuinely underappreciated pedagogical philosophy that a mismatch between a student and a curriculum is frequently a translation problem rather than a capacity problem. SJ's arc across the full film also deserves a final, more complete accounting before this analysis moves toward its ending sequence, because his relationship with Michael evolves in ways that are easy to overlook amid the more dramatically weighted scenes involving Leigh and the NCAA investigation. What begins as simple childlike fascination, SJ treating Michael as something between a bodyguard and an action figure, gradually develops into something more reciprocal and more consequential to the plot itself. By the film's later stretches, SJ has become Michael's de facto agent in miniature, negotiating recruiting attention, fielding calls from interested programs, applying a child's uncomplicated transactional logic to a process the adults around him treat with far more anxiety and caution. This represents a meaningful thematic inversion the film sets up deliberately: the youngest, least socially sophisticated member of the household becoming genuinely useful and competent in navigating a high-stakes adult process, specifically because he never absorbed the anxious, hierarchical thinking that complicates how the adults around him approach the same situation. SJ's uncomplicated affection for Michael remains the emotional through line that never wavers or requires resolution, precisely because it was never built on anything other than genuine mutual regard in the first place. On the subject of craft, it is worth returning briefly to production design, an element of filmmaking that rarely receives specific attention in casual coverage of this movie despite doing real, if subtle, storytelling work throughout. The Tuohy home itself functions almost as a character in its own right, warm, cluttered with personal photographs and family artifacts, visually coded as lived-in rather than merely wealthy, a deliberate choice that distinguishes this household from the kind of sterile, showcase wealth often used in film to signal emotional distance or superficiality. This matters specifically because it supports the film's broader argument that Leigh's decisiveness, while sometimes controlling, is rooted in genuine warmth rather than performative charity. Contrast this with the sparse, institutional spaces Michael occupies before moving in, the shared apartment briefly glimpsed in early scenes, the school hallways rendered in flat, impersonal lighting, and the visual argument becomes even clearer that physical environment in this film consistently mirrors emotional accessibility. Costume design performs similar quiet work, particularly in how Michael's wardrobe evolves gradually rather than through a single dramatic makeover moment, avoiding the kind of visually obvious transformation sequence that would have cheapened the more gradual emotional transformation the film is actually tracking. Finally, before this section transitions into the film's closing movement, it is worth situating this entire analysis within a broader question about what makes certain based on true story films endure in cultural memory, while others fade quickly despite similar initial commercial success. Part of the answer lies in exactly the structural discipline this analysis has spent considerable time tracing, planted details paying off later, character psychology remaining consistent even as circumstances change dramatically, restraint deployed precisely at moments where a lesser film would have reached for easy sentimentality instead. But part of the answer also lies in something less controllable by any single filmmaking choice: the way a story's afterlife in the real world continues shaping how audiences engage with it years after its theatrical release. The Blind Side exists today at an unusually complicated intersection of these two forces, a genuinely well-crafted piece of filmmaking whose legacy has become inseparable from a real-world legal controversy involving the actual people it depicts. As this analysis moves into its final movement, that dual awareness of craft and complication existing together rather than canceling each other out remains the lens through which everything that follows should be understood. It is also worth addressing directly a handful of the specific questions viewers most commonly search for after watching this film, because engaging with them here serves the analysis rather than distracting from it. Is The Blind Side based on a true story? Yes, the film is adapted from Michael Lewis's nonfiction book, itself built on real events involving Michael Oher and the Tuohy family beginning in the early 2000s. Though as with nearly every biographical film, specific scenes, timelines, and dialogue are compressed or dramatized for narrative clarity rather than presented as a literal documentary record. What position did Michael Oher actually play, and did his real career match the film's framing? He did indeed play left tackle, was selected in the first round of the NFL draft, and went on to a lengthy professional career that included a Super Bowl championship, broadly validating the film's central athletic trajectory, even though the full picture surrounding his relationship with the Tuohy family has become considerably more complicated in the years since. Why does the film focus so heavily on Leigh and rather than Michael? This is a legitimate structural criticism worth taking seriously, and the film's decision to filter much of its perspective through Leigh's point of view reflects both a screenwriting choice and, more uncomfortably, a broader pattern in how these kinds of stories tend to get told. It is worth closing this stretch of the analysis with a brief acknowledgement of the film's use of humor, an element that rarely receives serious critical attention despite doing genuine structural work throughout the runtime. Sean Tuohy's dry commentary, SJ's uncomplicated enthusiasm, and several lighter exchanges around the family dinner table are not simply filler between the story's heavier emotional beats. They function as a deliberate pacing mechanism, allowing the film to maintain warmth and accessibility even as it moves through genuinely difficult material, homelessness, institutional distrust, the threat of a family being publicly scrutinized and potentially torn apart by legal investigation. A film handling this subject matter with unrelenting seriousness throughout its entire runtime risks becoming exhausting rather than moving, and the strategic placement of humor, always in service of character rather than as a disconnected comic aside, keeps the audience emotionally available for the heavier scenes that follow each lighter moment. The film largely succeeds at this balance, and that success is part of why it achieved the broad commercial reach it did, appealing simultaneously to audiences seeking genuine emotional depth and audiences who simply wanted an entertaining, accessible family film for a weekend outing. One final connective thread deserves attention before this section formally closes, tying together nearly everything traced so far into a single observation about narrative economy. Notice how rarely this film wastes a scene on pure spectacle disconnected from character. Even its most visually impressive football sequences are staged and edited to reinforce psychological or relational information rather than existing purely to excite an audience with athletic display for its own sake. This is a discipline many mainstream biographical dramas lack, particularly those built around sports, where the temptation to lean into crowd-pleasing athletic spectacle at the expense of character development is considerable and commercially understandable. The Blind Side largely resists that temptation, and the cumulative effect of that resistance is a film that rewards close, attentive viewing far more than its inspirational, awards season marketing ever suggested it might. Every scene this analysis has examined in detail, from the opening definition on screen to the quiet couch on the first night to the compliance officer's pointed question, participates in the same unified argument about visibility, translation, and belated recognition. That structural unity is precisely what separates genuinely well-constructed storytelling from a looser collection of individually effective scenes, and it is the primary reason this film has remained culturally durable enough, complications and all, to still be worth this level of sustained critical attention more than 15 years after its original theatrical release. Delivering an honest verdict on this film requires starting with the story itself, and specifically with what the story accomplishes structurally rather than simply how it makes an audience feel in the moment. Judged purely on narrative construction, this is a well-built screenplay, and this analysis has spent considerable time demonstrating exactly why. Planted details that pay off precisely when they need to, a consistent thematic through line running from the opening definition on screen through the closing driveway farewell, and a disciplined refusal to let spectacle substitute for character development even in a genre where that substitution is common and commercially tempting. The story earns its emotional beats rather than manufacturing them through score or editing tricks, and the restraint this analysis has praised repeatedly across every major sequence. The Thanksgiving confrontation, the guardianship conversation, the NCAA investigation, the college departure, reflects a screenplay confident enough in its own material to let silence and stillness do work that a less disciplined script would have handed to dialogue or music instead, where the story is genuinely weaker, and this is worth stating plainly rather than glossing over in service of an uncomplicated positive review, is in its handling of secondary institutional characters, particularly the football coach and the various college recruiters who populate the film's middle stretch. These figures function almost entirely as plot mechanisms rather than fully realized people, existing to advance Michael's arc without receiving any interiority of their own, a structural shortcut the film takes repeatedly without ever quite earning narratively. Turning to characters specifically, this film's central relationships remain genuinely believable and worth caring about, which is not a small accomplishment given how easily this kind of material could tip into sentimentality, or hagiography. Leigh, as this analysis has traced at length, is written with real specificity rather than as a generic saint. Her controlling tendencies never fully sanded down or excused, her decisiveness shown to have real costs alongside its obvious benefits. Michael, despite receiving comparatively less interiority than Leigh and throughout much of the film, remains a coherent, consistent character whose psychology, rooted in learned distrust of permanence, this analysis has traced from his very first scene through his final departure. S.J., Collins, Sean, and Miss Sue each receive enough specific characterization to avoid feeling purely functional. Where character work falters, and this deserves specific naming rather than vague acknowledgement, is in the film's handling of Michael's biological family and his life immediately prior to meeting the Tuohys, rendered almost entirely through brief, undramatized references rather than any sustained scene work. A gap the source material and Michael's own subsequent public statements fill in considerably more detail than the film itself ever attempts to. On direction and craft, this analysis has already traced John Lee Hancock's specific choices in detail across earlier sections. The disciplined cinematography favoring stillness over spectacle, Carter Burwell's restrained score, the deliberate visual contrast between the Tuohy homes lived in warmth and the sparse, institutional spaces Michael occupies before moving in. Judged as a piece of directorial craft, this film consistently makes the harder, more disciplined choice over the easier, more conventionally crowd-pleasing one. If there is a genuine craft weakness worth naming here, it lies in pacing during the film's middle stretch, specifically the sequence covering Michael's early academic struggles and his initial tentative football performances, which occasionally repeats similar beats, uncertainty followed by small breakthrough followed by renewed uncertainty, without varying the rhythm enough to avoid feeling slightly repetitive across a small handful of consecutive scenes, a minor but genuine pacing issue in an otherwise tightly constructed film. Regarding emotional impact, the central question any verdict has to answer honestly is whether the film earns its biggest moments rather than simply claiming them, and across the vast majority of its runtime, this film does earn them, precisely because of the patient groundwork this analysis has traced scene by scene. The driveway farewell lands with genuine weight because the film has spent nearly 2 hours establishing exactly what that separation costs every character involved. Where emotional impact occasionally falters is in a small number of transitional montage sequences, particularly around Michael's early football improvement, where the film briefly reaches for more conventional inspirational sports movie shorthand, triumphant music paired with rapid successive shots of improvement that sits slightly at odds with the more restrained, patient emotional register the rest of the film establishes and largely maintains. Bringing these threads together into an overall recommendation and being specific rather than vague about what actually works and what does not, this is a genuinely well-crafted piece of mainstream filmmaking that earns its emotional power through disciplined, patient storytelling choices, restraint over spectacle, silence over exposition, planted detail over convenient coincidence. The single most significant weakness worth naming directly is the film's narrower structural choice to filter the vast majority of its perspective through Leigh and rather than through Michael, a choice that produces genuine craft benefits, a clearer, more consistently legible protagonist arc for a mainstream audience. But that also means a story fundamentally about a young man's autonomy and survival ends up told primarily through someone else's point of view. This is not a fatal flaw, but a fully honest verdict has to name it specifically rather than allowing the film's genuine emotional power to obscure a real and identifiable structural choice with real consequences for whose story this ultimately becomes. It is worth pausing here to address directly why this specific weakness matters more than it might initially appear to. A film's perspective is not a neutral formal choice. It actively shapes which characters' internal experience the audience is invited to fully inhabit versus which characters' experience remains, however sympathetically rendered, viewed primarily from the outside. Because Michael's internal experience is largely communicated through physical performance and withheld dialogue rather than direct access to his thoughts, the audience's understanding of his psychology arrives filtered through inference and interpretation rather than the kind of direct interiority Leigh receives through her more extensive dialogue and screen time. This matters specifically in a story about a young black man's life being shaped and narrated by the people around him, because the film's own formal choices risk quietly reproducing, at a structural level, exactly the dynamic its plot explicitly critiques, a story about who gets to be seen fully told primarily through the eyes of the person doing the seeing rather than the person being seen. Turning now to audience match. This film film is genuinely well suited to viewers who appreciated similarly structured, character-driven true story dramas built around a single formative relationship rather than broad ensemble triumph. Films in the vein of Remember the Titans for its inspirational sports framing, but considerably more interested in intimate family dynamics than team spectacle, or The Pursuit of Happiness for its focus on a single relationship's transformative power against a backdrop of institutional obstacles. This film is also, given the real-world context this analysis has addressed directly, particularly well suited to viewers interested in engaging critically with based-on-true story filmmaking more broadly. Conversely, viewers primarily seeking uncomplicated football spectacle, or viewers looking for a viewing experience entirely free of the kind of real-world ethical complication this analysis has spent considerable time addressing directly, may find this particular framing of the film less satisfying than a more conventional, purely celebratory review would offer. It is also worth being direct about who this analysis itself is best suited for. Viewers who want more than a simple plot summary and thumbs-up recommendation. Viewers genuinely interested in character psychology, thematic architecture, craft-specific observation, and honest engagement with a film's complicated cultural afterlife. It is worth expanding briefly on the comparative territory this analysis gestured toward earlier, where a film like The Pursuit of Happiness locates its emotional engine almost entirely within a single character's internal perseverance against external circumstance. This film distributes its emotional weight across an ensemble of relationships, each contributing a distinct mode of recognition and translation rather than concentrating the entire narrative burden on one protagonist's isolated struggle. Where a film like Remember the Titans uses a large ensemble cast to dramatize broader social change through collective action, this film deliberately narrows its scope to a single household, arguing implicitly that systemic recognition of overlooked talent and character often begins not with sweeping institutional reform but with one specific, sustained, individual relationship willing to do the difficult work other systems have failed to do. Before concluding this section of the analysis, it is worth returning briefly to a rhetorical question raised earlier. Having traced this film's genuine craft strengths alongside its specific, evident structural weaknesses, does this film still function as a meaningful, worthwhile piece of storytelling despite these complications, or does the real-world controversy fundamentally undermine what the film accomplishes as art? This analysis's position, stated directly, is that these two questions are not actually in tension the way they might initially appear to be. A film can be genuinely well-crafted, emotionally earned, and thematically sophisticated as a piece of storytelling, while simultaneously existing within a more complicated, ethically unresolved real-world context surrounding the people it depicts. As this verdict section moves toward its conclusion, it is worth naming one final specific craft observation: the film's handling of sound design during moments of emotional restraint. Listen specifically to the ambient sound design during the quiet post-investigation scene between Michael and Leigh. The scene is nearly free of score, relying instead on subtle environmental sound, a ticking clock, distant household noise, the kind of ambient texture that grounds a scene in physical reality rather than signaling emotion through orchestration. Concluding this stretch of the analysis, it is worth restating plainly what this verdict has established. The Blind Side succeeds as a piece of disciplined, well-constructed emotional storytelling, earning its central relationship through patient, specific craft choices. Its most significant limitation, its choice to filter a story fundamentally about a young man's autonomy primarily through another character's perspective, is real and worth naming honestly. And its real-world afterlife, involving genuine legal complications, means that engaging with this film honestly today requires holding artistic accomplishment and ethical complexity in the same frame simultaneously. It is worth expanding directly on the white savior criticism this analysis has referenced several times throughout its runtime, because the term itself is often deployed as a blunt dismissal rather than engaged with as the specific critical framework it actually represents. The critique, in its most rigorous form, is a structural critique about which characters' agency, interiority, and narrative arc a story centers, about whether the person receiving help is rendered as a full subject making meaningful choices or primarily as an object whose transformation exists to illustrate the generosity and growth of the person helping them. Measured against that more precise standard, this film occupies genuinely contested territory rather than falling cleanly on either side of the debate. This analysis has already demonstrated that the film does grant Michael a specific, meaningful moment of articulated agency in the Ole Miss commitment scene. But this analysis has also demonstrated that Michael's interiority remains comparatively underdeveloped relative to Leigh's throughout the majority of the runtime. Both of these observations are simultaneously true. Michael Oher's own public statements about the film, made across various interviews in the years following its release and considerably amplified once the 2023 legal filing became public, deserve direct acknowledgement. Oher has stated in multiple interviews that he felt the film's portrayal of his football knowledge prior to meeting the Tuohys was inaccurate, noting that he possessed considerably more football understanding before his relationship with the family than the film's narrative suggests, where his athletic instinct is largely presented as something Miss Sue and Leigh needed to unlock and translate for him. If Oher's own account is accurate, the film's dramatization of that translation process may itself represent a simplification of his actual pre-existing competence. This does not invalidate the craft observations this analysis has made about how the film constructs that translation narrative on screen, but it does mean the thesis this analysis has attributed to the film should be understood specifically as the film's own narrative argument rather than as an uncontested account of what actually happened to the real Michael Oher. It is worth situating this film within the broader cultural conversation about representation in mainstream Hollywood filmmaking that intensified considerably in the years following its original release. Terms like white savior narrative entered much broader popular usage in film criticism, specifically in the years after this film's release, meaning the critical framework available to engage with this film upon its initial reception was considerably less developed than the framework available to a contemporary viewer revisiting it today. This helps explain why this film's critical reputation has shifted somewhat over time, not because the film itself changed, but because the critical vocabulary available to interrogate films like it has become considerably more sophisticated. Returning briefly to specific craft elements, it is worth naming the film's use of the opening definition and closing text as a formal bracket around the entire narrative. The film opens by defining its central football term before any character appears on screen. It closes with factual text confirming Michael's actual professional trajectory, converting the abstract definition from the opening into concrete, real-world confirmation that the metaphor the film has spent its entire runtime developing actually mapped onto a real person's real-life outcome. It is also worth addressing a specific practical question viewers frequently raise, concerning whether the specific institutional dynamics the film portrays reflect broader patterns in how private and parochial schools historically handled the recruitment and treatment of academically underprepared but athletically gifted students. The general dynamic the film depicts, athletic recruitment outpacing genuine academic support infrastructure, reflects a documented pattern discussed extensively in sports journalism and academic research covering high school and collegiate athletics more broadly. As this extended verdict section finally concludes, it is worth acknowledging that a truly comprehensive treatment of this film's cultural significance requires holding together nearly every thread this analysis has traced, its considerable craft achievements, its specific and evidenced structural limitations, its complicated real-world afterlife, and the broader critical and cultural context that has continued to evolve around it. Neither uncomplicated celebration nor uncomplicated dismissal adequately captures what this film actually is. It is worth drawing one final comparative connection, this time to Michael Lewis's broader body of nonfiction work. Lewis built much of his career writing about undervalued talent and inefficient systems of recognition across entirely different fields, most famously in Moneyball, which examines how professional baseball systematically undervalued specific player skills for decades due to outdated evaluation methods. The Blind Side applies a strikingly similar structural argument to an individual person rather than to a market inefficiency. Michael Oher possessed genuine, measurable value that existing evaluation systems, academic, athletic, and social, consistently failed to recognize until someone outside those systems' usual assumptions was willing to look more carefully. Turning briefly to a production detail worth naming specifically, this film reportedly underperformed studio expectations during its opening weekend tracking before word of mouth, driven substantially by older and female audience demographics historically underserved by football-adjacent sports dramas, propelled it to a considerably longer and more lucrative theatrical run than its initial box office trajectory suggested. This commercial pattern retroactively validates the film's own structural choices, the decision to center family dynamics over football action, precisely the elements this analysis has argued represent the film's most significant craft achievements throughout. Released during a particularly competitive awards season alongside several several critically acclaimed dramas. This film's combination of significant commercial success and a Best Actress win, alongside a Best Picture nomination that surprised some industry observers given the film's more populist, mainstream sensibility, reflects the genuinely unusual position this film occupied at the intersection of crowd-pleasing entertainment and formal industry recognition. As this genuinely extensive verdict section reaches its true conclusion, structural craft assessment, character-specific evaluation, direction, and sound design observation, the white savior critique engaged with real precision. Michael Oher's own contested account of his portrayal, broader cultural context around evolving critical vocabulary, comparative positioning within Michael Lewis's larger body of work, and specific production and commercial detail have all been covered. This density is intentional and reflects this analysis's central organizing principle throughout its entire runtime, that a film this genuinely complicated deserves an analysis willing to actually sit with that complication rather than resolving it prematurely. The next and final movement of this analysis will deliver the concluding thoughts this entire runtime has been building toward, a specific closing statement about what this film ultimately means. Before moving into the next stretch of routine parts, it is worth using this space to close out a visual motif this analysis has referenced in passing but never fully traced across its complete arc: the recurring use of family photographs displayed throughout the Tuohy home. In Michael's earliest scenes inside the house, the camera lingers briefly on hallway walls covered in framed pictures of Sean, Leigh, and Collins, and SJ across the years, a visual record of belonging that Michael notably does not appear within. This is not an accidental detail. It is a quiet, specific piece of production design, doing exactly the kind of work this analysis has praised repeatedly throughout its runtime, communicating information about Michael's outsider status without a single line of dialogue stating it directly. The payoff to this visual detail arrives later in the film, when a new photograph, including Michael, finally appears among the others on that same wall. This is a subtle, almost throwaway visual beat, easy to miss entirely on a first viewing, but it functions as one of the clearest possible confirmations of everything this analysis has argued about the film's central thesis, that belonging is established not through a single dramatic declaration, but through the accumulation of small, physical evidence that a person now exists permanently within a family's visual and literal record of itself. It is also worth closing out a second recurring symbolic thread this analysis flagged early on, but is not yet fully resolved: the film's careful attention to doors and thresholds as a physical representation of Michael's psychological journey. The film's opening scenes establish Michael as someone perpetually on the outside of locked doors, sleeping in a laundromat, waiting outside buildings he has no key to enter. The first night at the Tuohy home specifically emphasizes the presence of a door Michael can lock from the inside for what the film implies is the first time in years. This threshold imagery recurs throughout the film at several key transition points: Michael pausing at the threshold of the Tuohy kitchen before entering for his first family meal, the compliance officer's office door during the Ole Miss conversation, and finally, the open car door during the college departure sequence, a threshold Michael now walks through and back out of freely, without hesitation, precisely because the film has established that the home behind him will remain open regardless of how far he travels beyond it. Turning briefly to composer Carter Burwell's broader career, it is worth noting that his restrained approach to this film's score is consistent with a body of work built substantially on collaborations with directors known for tonal precision and emotional understatement, including a long-standing collaborative relationship with the Coen brothers. This context matters because it helps explain why this particular composer was well suited to a film whose central craft argument rests on trusting silence and restraint over conventional emotional signaling. A composer with a different sensibility, more accustomed to broad, sweeping orchestral scoring common to mainstream sports dramas, might have pushed this film toward a more conventionally manipulative emotional register, undercutting exactly the disciplined tonal control this analysis has identified as one of the film's most significant achievements. It is worth addressing directly, for viewers who frequently search for this information, what has become of the broader Tuohy family and their public presence in the years following both the film's original release and the more recent legal controversy this analysis has addressed at length. Sean and Leigh and Tuohy have remained public figures to varying degrees since the film's release, continuing philanthropic and business activities in Memphis, though their public visibility and the tone of media coverage surrounding them has shifted noticeably since the 2023 legal filing became public. SJ Tuohy has spoken publicly at various points defending the family's relationship with Michael, offering a perspective perspective this analysis has not treated as definitive, but has acknowledged as one legitimate account among several competing narratives now circulating about the true nature of the relationship depicted on screen. This is also a useful point to address the specific, frequently searched question of where Michael Oher himself has stood publicly on his broader legacy. Oher has spoken publicly, including in his own memoir published years after the film's release, about wanting his football career and personal accomplishments to be understood on their own terms, rather than primarily through the lens of the family relationship the film centers so heavily. This connects to one of this analysis's most consistently repeated arguments, that the film's own perspective choices may have inadvertently shaped public perception of Michael's own achievements in ways he has since publicly pushed back against, wanting recognition for his own discipline, work ethic, and football intelligence independent of the narrative of rescue and transformation the film constructs around him. As this deficit-catching stretch of the analysis concludes and the remaining routine parts resume, it is worth briefly restating the through line connecting everything covered across this section: the photograph wall, the recurring threshold imagery, Burwell's restrained scoring choices, and the ongoing real-world conversation surrounding the Tuohy family and Michael Oher's own stated preferences about his legacy. Each of these threads reinforces the same central argument this entire analysis has built toward, that this film's considerable craft achievements and its complicated real-world afterlife are two dimensions of the same ongoing story about visibility, translation, and who ultimately gets to author the meaning of a life once it becomes valuable enough for other people to want to tell it. It is worth adding one further piece of closing analysis here, examining how this film's specific structural approach, restraint, patient character work, and a refusal to let spectacle overwhelm psychological detail has influenced or at least anticipated a broader shift in how mainstream sports biopics have been constructed in the years since its release. Several subsequent films built around real athletes and real families have adopted a noticeably similar approach, de-emphasizing pure athletic spectacle in favor of closely observed family and relational dynamics. Suggesting this film's commercial and critical success helped demonstrate to studios that audiences would respond enthusiastically to this quieter, more character-focused version of the genre. It is also worth returning briefly to a specific piece of unfinished business: the question of how Miss Sue's own arc resolves by the film's conclusion. She begins the film as someone hired into a purely transactional academic support role, tasked with keeping an athletically valuable student eligible rather than genuinely invested in his individual growth. By the film's later stretches, her relationship with Michael has clearly deepened beyond that initial transactional framing. This transformation mirrors, on a smaller scale, the exact arc this analysis has traced at length for Leigh and herself, someone beginning in a role defined by function and obligation who gradually comes to operate from genuine personal investment instead. Concluding this deficit-catching stretch fully, whether examining visual motifs like photographs and thresholds, compositional choices in the score, the ongoing real-world conversation surrounding the people this story depicts, or secondary character arcs like Miss Sue's own quiet transformation, every thread this analysis has traced returns consistently to the same underlying argument: that meaningful recognition of another person's worth requires sustained, specific, individualized attention, rather than generic goodwill or passive good intentions alone. One additional thread worth closing before this supplementary section fully ends concerns the specific evolution of Tuohy's relationship with Michael beyond what this analysis traced earlier regarding her initial social discomfort. By the film's later stretches, Collins is shown actively including Michael in her own social world without hesitation, a reversal from her earlier guardedness that the film earns specifically through accumulated small moments rather than through any single dramatic reconciliation scene. Taken together with Miss Sue's transformation, SJ's uncomplicated loyalty, and Sean's protective diligence, all four secondary relationships now form a complete, mutually reinforcing pattern, distinct individuals arriving at the same fundamental recognition of Michael's worth through entirely different emotional and social pathways. A structural achievement this film rarely receives adequate specific credit for in surrounding critical conversation. Bringing this entire analysis to its true closing point, it is worth delivering the specific final line this runtime has been building towards since its opening hook, a thought meant to stay with you rather than simply summarize what has already been said. This is not a story about a family who saved a boy from the street. It is a story about how long it takes, and how many different people it requires, to finally see someone the world had already decided wasn't worth looking at twice, and about what gets lost, even in the best version version of that story, when the person being seen never quite gets to hold the pen. That tension between genuine rescue and incomplete authorship, between real love and real cost, is not a flaw this film accidentally stumbled into. It is, whether the filmmakers fully intended it or not, the most honest thing this story has to say, and it is considerably more interesting than the uncomplicated inspirational tagline this film has been marketed under for over 15 years. Before moving into the remaining stretch of this analysis, it is worth pausing to invite genuine reflection rather than closing the door on this conversation entirely. Tell me directly, after everything this analysis has traced across every section, did the ending of this film land for you the way it lands within its own narrative frame, or did it leave something unresolved once you consider everything this analysis has laid out about Michael's own contested account of his story? There is no required answer here, but a story this genuinely complicated deserves an audience willing to sit with its own unresolved response rather than defaulting immediately to either uncomplicated celebration or uncomplicated dismissal. Turning now toward material this analysis has not yet had the opportunity to address directly, it is worth examining how this film has been received specifically within Black film criticism and cultural commentary in the years since its release. Several prominent Black critics and commentators raised concerns upon the film's original release that mainstream coverage largely did not amplify at the time, specifically around the pattern this analysis has already examined regarding whose interiority receives narrative priority, and around a broader, recurring pattern in Hollywood filmmaking where stories ostensibly about Black protagonists end up structured primarily around a white character's moral growth and decision-making. This critical tradition predates the more recent 2023 legal controversy by well over a decade, meaning the structural concerns this analysis has raised throughout are not simply retroactive judgments imposed by hindsight. This is worth naming specifically because it complicates any narrative suggesting that concerns about this film's perspective and framing are a purely contemporary phenomenon emerging only after the Oher family's legal dispute became public. The two conversations, one about narrative perspective and representation, the other about the specific legal and financial structure underlying the real relationship, are related but distinct, and treating them as a single unified critique risks flattening both. It is also worth acknowledging directly, in the interest of full transparency about how this analysis itself was constructed, the specific competitive positioning this creator identified before writing a single word of this script. Most existing coverage of this film treats it as a straightforward, uncomplicated inspirational story, offering plot summary followed by a simple recommendation. This analysis was built specifically around the recognition that this approach leaves considerable analytical territory unexplored, prioritizing depth and honest complexity over the quicker, more conventionally digestible coverage that dominates existing discussion of this film across most other channels. As this analysis moves toward its true conclusion, it is worth restating one final time the through line connecting every section covered across this entire runtime. Every scene this analysis has examined, every character arc it has traced, every craft choice it has named specifically, and every piece of real-world context it has addressed honestly, returns to the same central question this film asks and only partially answers. What does it actually take for a person the world has decided not to see to finally become fully visible, and what, even in the most well-intentioned version of that process, does the person being seen still not get to control? It is worth expanding briefly on Michael Oher's actual NFL career, since the film's closing text gestures toward his professional trajectory without dramatizing it. Oher was selected in the first round of the NFL draft, going on to play left tackle professionally for over a decade across multiple teams, and won a Super Bowl championship during his career. This factual outcome matters specifically because it demonstrates that the recognition Michael received within the Tuohy household and the Wingate football program translated into sustained, tangible professional success. At the same time, Oher's own subsequent public statements complicate exactly how much credit the film's specific narrative of unlocked potential deserves, since he has suggested his football understanding predated the family's involvement more substantially than the film's dramatization implies. It is also worth applying, briefly and precisely, a specific critical framework sometimes called inspiration framing, referring to stories that use one person's hardship and eventual success primarily to generate uplifting emotional payoff for an audience not directly experiencing that hardship. The film does grant Michael specific, meaningful moments of agency and interiority, undercutting a purely reductive reading. But the film's marketing and broader cultural reception have frequently flattened the story into exactly this kind of uncomplicated uplift narrative, without necessarily engaging with the more complicated structural questions this analysis has raised throughout. Turning briefly to a final comparative note, it is worth situating Sandra Bullock's performance within the broader arc of her career, since her Academy Award win for this role represented a notable departure from the romantic comedy work that had defined much of her prior filmography. This analysis's own close examination of her specific performance choices, the physical restraint, the controlled emotional escalation across the story's second half, supports a reading of the performance as genuinely accomplished on its own technical merits. As this stretch approaches its close, it is worth acknowledging how differently this film reads depending on when a viewer first encounters it. Audiences who watched this film upon its original 2009 release experienced a considerably more straightforward emotional journey than audiences encountering it for the first time today, armed with fuller context. Neither viewing experience is more valid than the other, and both readings are genuinely defensible given the information available to each respective audience at the time. Before this stretch fully concludes, it is worth naming one more moral dilemma. Given that this film's original theatrical audience experienced it without the fuller context now available, does that mean their emotional response was somehow less legitimate than a more critically cautious response available to a contemporary viewer? This analysis's position is that emotional responses to art are not retroactively invalidated by information that emerges afterward. A person moved genuinely by this film in 2009 experienced something real and valid at the time. It is also worth naming, one final time, how this specific piece of analysis has tried to differ from typical coverage not just in depth but in tone, avoiding both uncritical celebration and reflexive dismissal, taking a popular, widely loved piece of mainstream entertainment seriously enough to examine its construction carefully, honest enough to name its real limitations specifically, and humble enough to acknowledge genuine uncertainty where the available public record does not support a confident, definitive verdict. Before continuing into the routine remaining parts, it is worth using this dedicated space to fully close the accumulated deficit rather than letting it continue compounding, and to do so by covering genuinely new analytical territory rather than repeating points this analysis has already made. One thread worth opening for the first time here concerns Michael's relationship to his own biological mother, referenced only briefly across the film's runtime, but carrying real emotional weight worth naming directly. The film handles this relationship with notable restraint, never staging a confrontation or a tearful reunion scene, instead allowing brief, undramatized references to convey that this bond, however complicated by addiction and instability, was never simply erased or replaced by Michael's new family. This matters because it resists a common and considerably lazier storytelling shortcut, positioning a new family as a clean, uncomplicated replacement for an absent one. The film instead suggests something more psychologically accurate, that Michael carries both relationships simultaneously, gratitude and love for the Tuohys existing alongside unresolved grief for the mother he does not get to have a conventional relationship with, a grief the film never fully resolves because real grief of this kind rarely resolves cleanly within any reasonable runtime. This connects to a theme this earlier analysis named but did not fully develop: grief operating quietly beneath the surface of what otherwise reads as a fundamentally hopeful, uplifting story. Michael's guardedness, his difficulty trusting permanence, his hesitance to fully accept the Tuohy's stability as real, functions not simply as a generic trauma response, but specifically as unprocessed grief for a family structure that could have existed differently under different circumstances. The film gestures toward this without ever making it explicit through dialogue, trusting Quinton Aaron's physical performance to carry emotional information the screenplay itself withholds. This adds a layer of psychological complexity to Michael's character that pure plot summary entirely misses, reframing his eventual acceptance of the Tuohy family not simply as gratitude for rescue, but as a complicated negotiation between honoring an imperfect past and embracing an unexpectedly stable present. It is also worth addressing directly a theme this analysis has touched on repeatedly, but never named explicitly as its own distinct thread: masculinity, and specifically the particular version of protective masculinity Michael embodies throughout the story. Michael's central character trait, his overwhelming instinct to physically protect the people he loves, is coded throughout the film as a specifically masculine form of care, distinct from but complementary to the more traditionally coded nurturing roles Leigh and Miss Sue occupy. The film is careful never to frame Michael's size and strength as inherent inherently threatening, but instead consistently reframes physical power as a form of love, protection expressed through the body rather than through words Michael has never been especially comfortable using. This represents a genuinely interesting intervention into broader cultural narratives about Black masculinity specifically, offering a portrayal of physical strength explicitly coded as gentle and protective rather than threatening. Given how frequently mainstream media has historically coded large, physically powerful Black men in considerably more one-dimensional terms. Turning to a specific piece of information viewers frequently search for, it is worth addressing why the number 74, Michael's jersey number throughout much of his football career, carries particular significance within football culture, since numbers in this range are traditionally reserved for offensive linemen specifically. This detail reinforces, in a small but concrete way, the specific positional identity this analysis has argued functions as the film's central organizing metaphor, embedding the film's thematic argument into details that operate beneath the level of conscious audience awareness. It is worth returning briefly to costume design, with one additional observation: the deliberate visual distinction between Michael's practice gear and his eventual game day uniform, a transition the film uses to mark his psychological readiness rather than simply his physical conditioning. Early practice sequences show Michael in ill-fitting, borrowed equipment, visually reinforcing his outsider status even after he has already been welcomed into the Tuohy household. His eventual game uniform, properly fitted and worn with visible confidence, marks a visual culmination of the psychological transformation this analysis has traced from the film's opening scenes onward. It is worth inviting one additional moral dilemma here, concerning the specific ethics of biographical filmmaking more broadly. When a film adapts a real person's life story for commercial entertainment purposes, what obligations, if any, does the resulting production owe to that person beyond whatever legal consent was originally obtained, particularly when that person was a minor at the time the underlying events took place? This is a genuinely open question without an easy answer, and it applies well beyond this single film to an entire genre built around real people's most vulnerable, formative experiences. It is also worth addressing a specific question frequently typed by viewers researching this film further. What happened to Wingate Christian School, the fictionalized name the film uses for the real institution Michael actually attended, and whether that institution's broader approach to academically underprepared athletes has changed since? Broader conversations about balancing athletic recruitment with genuine academic support have continued to evolve across secondary and collegiate athletics more generally in the years since this film's release, a conversation this story contributed to shaping in the broader cultural imagination. Turning briefly to another underexplored comparative angle, it is worth situating this film alongside other prominent films exploring similar themes of institutional recognition and belated visibility across different genres entirely. Stories about gifted individuals overlooked by rigid institutional systems appear across numerous genres, from music dramas about self-taught talents dismissed by formally trained gatekeepers to workplace dramas about overlooked employees whose contributions go unrecognized until an outside advocate intervenes. Recognizing this film as part of a considerably broader storytelling tradition reinforces this analysis's argument that the film's true subject matter extends well beyond football specifically. It is worth naming one additional audience engagement question here. If you were in Leigh's position, encountering a stranger in genuine need on a night when you had every reasonable excuse to simply keep driving, what specifically do you think would need to be true about your own life circumstances, your own resources, your own sense of personal responsibility for you to make the same choice she made? This question reframes the film's central inciting incident not as a simple test of individual character in isolation, but as a question deeply entangled with privilege, resource, and circumstance. Closing out this dedicated deficit covering section, it is worth restating the through line connecting every new thread introduced across this segment: Michael's unresolved grief regarding his biological family, the film's quiet reworking of protective Black masculinity, the specific symbolic weight of football's numbering conventions, costume design's role in marking psychological readiness, the broader ethics of biographical filmmaking involving minors, this film's place within a wider storytelling tradition extending beyond sports, and a final invitation to examine the role of privilege in enabling meaningful intervention. Every thread reinforces this analysis's consistently repeated central argument that genuine recognition of another person's worth is neither simple nor cost-free. One final thread worth closing concerns the specific, easily overlooked detail of Leigh's own professional background as an interior designer, a career detail the film establishes early but rarely connects explicitly to her broader character arc. An interior designer's professional skill involves precisely the kind of attentive, detail-oriented observation this analysis has argued defines Leigh's core character trait, the ability to notice what a space lacks and to see clearly what would make that space feel complete, occupied, and cared for. Reading her decision to bring Michael into her home through this specific professional lens reframes her actions as a natural extension of her existing professional sensibility rather than a sudden, uncharacteristic act of charity. It is worth adding one further substantive thread before this section fully closes, examining the film's specific handling of Memphis as a physical and cultural setting, since geography and regional identity function as more than simple backdrop throughout this story. The film consistently emphasizes markers of a specific Southern, evangelical Christian social world, country club culture, private religious schooling, college football fandom operating as a genuinely central organizing force in regional identity. And these details are not incidental texture, but active participants in the story's thematic architecture. Understanding this Southern evangelical country club world as a specific, historically particular social ecosystem sharpens exactly what kind of exclusion and eventual inclusion this story is actually depicting. It is also worth closing with a final observation about the film's title sequence and how its typography and visual presentation reinforce the thematic argument this analysis has traced throughout regarding definition and recognition. The film's opening title card, presenting the dictionary-style definition of the blind side before any character appears, uses a deliberately clinical, textbook-style visual presentation, distinct from the warmer, more intimate visual language the film adopts once it moves into the Tuohy household and Michael's personal story. This visual contrast establishes institutional, abstract categorization as the starting point the story needs to move away from in order to arrive at genuine, individualized human recognition. One last thread deserves inclusion here, addressing a specific practical question about the difference between how this film handles its insane subplot compared to how similar recruiting scandals have played out in real, documented cases across college athletics more broadly. Unlike many real-world recruiting violation cases, which frequently involve clear evidence of improper financial inducement, the film is careful to construct its version of institutional scrutiny around a genuinely ambiguous situation, one where reasonable investigators could suspect wrongdoing based on surface-level pattern matching without actual evidence of the kind of explicit violation the pattern might suggest. This willingness to sit in genuine ambiguity, rather than manufacturing an obviously innocent protagonist facing an obviously unreasonable institutional villain, represents exactly the kind of nuanced storytelling choice this analysis has praised repeatedly throughout its entire runtime. As this analysis moves into its penultimate stretch, it is worth returning briefly to the hook that opened this entire runtime, the claim that by the end of this film you might question who actually did the rescuing. Having now traced this story through every major relationship, every craft choice, every thematic thread, and every piece of real-world context surrounding it, it is worth answering that opening question directly rather than leaving it purely rhetorical. Leigh rescues Michael from homelessness and institutional invisibility in the most literal, material sense, and this analysis has never disputed the genuine significance of that intervention. But Michael, in a less literal but no less real sense, rescues something in Leigh and as well, a specific version of herself capable of risking real social standing, real comfort, and real certainty in service of something larger than her own established, controlled world. Watching her arc across this entire film, from a woman whose decisiveness operated safely within her own household and business, to a woman willing to publicly stake her reputation and her family's stability on a relationship many people around her actively doubted, reveals a mutual transformation this analysis has traced carefully rather than a one-directional narrative of pure charity flowing in a single direction from giver to recipient. It is worth expanding on this mutual transformation with more specificity than the opening hook could offer before the story itself had been examined in detail. Leigh's own account, in interviews given around the film's original release, repeatedly emphasizes that her family, and specifically her own sense of purpose, changed as significantly through knowing Michael as his own circumstances changed through knowing them. This is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as simple promotional rhetoric designed to make an unequal power relationship appear more mutual and balanced than it actually was. Genuine relationships, even ones beginning from a place of significant material and social imbalance, accounts, can produce authentic transformation on both sides without that mutuality erasing the very real difference in risk, vulnerability, and stakes each party actually carried into the relationship. Michael risked far more by trusting this family than Leigh, and risked by extending that trust. A power imbalance this analysis has never minimized throughout its entire runtime, but acknowledging that imbalance does not require denying that something genuine and mutually significant also occurred alongside it. Turning toward material this analysis has not yet fully addressed, it is worth examining the film's broader box office and cultural impact, specifically within the context of Thanksgiving season theatrical releases, since this film's initial release timing during the holiday season proved unusually well suited to its specific subject matter. Films released during this particular window historically skew toward family-oriented, broadly accessible content designed for multi-generational theatrical attendance, and this film's combination of football-adjacent marketing appeal alongside genuine family drama substance allowed it to capture audience segments a more narrowly targeted release might have struggled to reach simultaneously. This release timing is worth naming specifically because the film's own central narrative moment, the night Leigh and first encounters Michael, is itself explicitly set during Thanksgiving, creating a meaningful thematic resonance between the film's content and its actual theatrical release window. It is also worth addressing a specific, frequently searched comparative question: how this film's box office performance and cultural longevity compares specifically to other Sandra Bullock-led films released around the same general period of her career. This film represented a notable high point in terms of both critical recognition and durable cultural presence compared to much of her surrounding filmography from the same general era, a distinction worth naming because it reinforces this analysis's earlier observation regarding how meaningfully this specific role functioned as a career-redefining moment. Turning to another underexplored angle, it is worth addressing directly how this film's approach to depicting Christian faith and religious institutional life compares to other mainstream films handling similar material. Since Wingate Christian School's religious identity functions as meaningful context throughout the story, without the film ever becoming explicitly didactic, the film treats faith as cultural context and community infrastructure rather than positioning religious conviction itself as the primary explanatory mechanism behind Leigh and's decision to help him. This is a meaningful distinction, since many mainstream films handling explicitly Christian institutional settings tend toward either uncomplicated religious affirmation or critical skepticism of religious motivation. While this film largely sidesteps both extremes, it is worth pausing here to invite one additional dual interpretation regarding how audiences might read Leigh and's religious background in relation to her decision-making. Some viewers read her Christian faith as the primary, foundational motivation behind her actions. Other viewers read her faith as important contextual background, but ultimately secondary to the more specific, personality-driven motivations this analysis has traced at length: her controlling decisiveness, her discomfort with unsolved problems, her specific professional sensibility as someone trained to notice absence and incompleteness. Both readings find meaningful support within the text itself, and the film's refusal to definitively resolve which motivation ultimately drives her actions most directly is itself worth naming as a deliberate ambiguity. Turning briefly toward a specific comparative note, it is worth situating this film's approach to depicting institutional football culture alongside the broader cultural conversation about football-related brain injury research that gained considerably more mainstream attention in the years immediately following this film's release. This film, released before that conversation fully entered mainstream public awareness, does not engage directly with football's physical risks in any sustained way. This is worth naming as a genuine limitation of the film's scope, one that reflects the specific cultural moment of its production, and it means viewers approaching this film today may find its largely uncomplicated celebration of football culture somewhat incomplete compared to how a similar film made today might be constructed. It is worth closing this stretch by returning to a specific engagement prompt, inviting reflection on which specific scene across this entire film resonated most strongly with your own personal experience, whether that scene involves recognition, belonging, institutional obstacle, or family transformation. This analysis has traced dozens of specific moments: the Thanksgiving car scene, the couch on the first night, the guardianship conversation, the Ole Miss commitment scene, the driveway farewell, and reasonable viewers will likely connect most strongly to different specific moments depending on their own life experience. As this stretch approaches its close, it is worth addressing one final frequently searched question: whether there are meaningful plans for any sequel or further further filmed exploration of Michael Oher's story, given the considerably more complicated real-world narrative that has emerged since this film's release. As of the most recent publicly available information, no major studio sequel has been announced, though the ongoing public conversation surrounding the 2023 legal controversy has generated considerable independent journalism and continued public discussion that functions as an unofficial, ongoing continuation of this story's public narrative. It is also worth addressing directly the specific question of language and dialogue choices throughout this film, since the screenplay makes a deliberate, notable choice to largely avoid depicting overt racial slurs or explicitly hostile racist dialogue directed at Michael, despite the story's clear engagement with themes of race, class, and institutional prejudice. This is a meaningful screenwriting choice worth naming specifically, since the film instead consistently locates prejudice in subtler registers: condescension disguised as concern, casual dismissal, institutional indifference rather than explicit hostility. This choice has generated some legitimate critical discussion regarding whether depicting prejudice exclusively through its subtler forms risks understating the more explicit forms of racism Michael and people in similar circumstances have historically faced, or whether this restraint instead represents a more sophisticated approach to depicting how prejudice actually operates most pervasively in contemporary institutional settings. Turning to another specific piece of context, it is worth naming how this film's source material, Michael Lewis's original book, was itself received critically and commercially prior to the film adaptation. Lewis's book received strong critical reception upon its own publication, praised specifically for its ambitious structural choice of interweaving Michael's personal story with broader historical analysis of football strategy and player valuation, a structural ambition this analysis has already noted the film adaptation largely abandons in favor of a more tightly focused family drama. It is worth naming one additional retention-relevant observation, specifically how this analysis's own structural approach has deliberately mirrored one of the central arguments it has made about the film itself, that meaningful understanding requires patient, sustained attention rather than quick, surface-level engagement. Just as this film resists easy spectacle in favor of accumulated, patient character development, this analysis has resisted delivering a quick, easily digestible verdict in favor of sustained, layered examination across every major dimension of the film worth considering. Concluding this considerably expanded part, it is worth restating clearly that this part has covered a deliberately wide range of previously unaddressed material, critical reception score context, the film's deliberate choices around depicting racial prejudice through subtler rather than explicit forms, the source material's own critical reception and structural ambition relative to the film adaptation, and a final reflection on how this analysis's own methodology has deliberately mirrored the patient, sustained attention this film itself models and rewards. One additional angle worth examining concerns the specific casting process behind this film, since Sandra Bullock has spoken publicly about initially passing on the role before eventually reconsidering, a detail worth naming because it illuminates how uncertain even experienced industry professionals were about this particular project's commercial viability before its eventual widespread success. This uncertainty reflects something genuinely instructive about the film industry's own limited ability to predict which projects will resonate broadly with audiences, since a story built around patient family drama rather than conventional sports spectacle represented a genuinely uncertain commercial proposition at the time of its production. It is also worth closing this section with a final piece of casting context regarding Quinton specifically, since his casting in this pivotal role represented a considerably less established actor taking on a role opposite a major, previously established star, a dynamic that itself mirrors on a purely industry level. The film's own thematic interest in recognizing talent that has not yet received institutional validation. Aaron's performance represented a genuinely significant opportunity for a less established performer to demonstrate considerable range and control opposite an Academy Award-winning co-star, and the film's eventual success helped establish his own subsequent career opportunities in ways that add a small but genuine real-world echo to the film's own fictional narrative about recognition and opportunity. Closing out the remaining deficit from the previous part with genuinely new material, it is worth addressing the film's MPAA rating and what that rating signals about its intended audience positioning. Rated PG-13 primarily for thematic elements, brief violence, and mature subject matter surrounding drug use and instability in Michael's early life. The film was deliberately constructed to remain accessible to family and teenage audiences along alongside adults, a rating consideration that shaped several specific creative choices this analysis has already examined, particularly the restraint around depicting explicit racial hostility and the largely undramatized handling of Michael's biological mother's addiction. This rating strategy reflects a deliberate commercial and creative decision to maximize the film's accessibility across a broad, multi-generational audience, consistent with this analysis's earlier observation about the film's unusually strong word-of-mouth-driven box office performance. It is also worth addressing the film's international box office performance briefly, since this analysis has focused primarily on domestic reception throughout its runtime. The film performed considerably more modestly overseas relative to its exceptionally strong domestic performance, a pattern common to films built around American football specifically, given the sport's comparatively limited global audience compared to more internationally popular sports. This disparity reinforces something worth naming directly, that this film's cultural resonance is specifically tied to distinctly American institutional and cultural context this analysis has traced throughout Southern evangelical culture, NCAA recruiting structures, and American football's specific social significance. Turning to a specific detail this analysis has not yet addressed, it is worth examining the film's home media release and the bonus content included across its various physical and digital releases. Several extended scenes available in home media releases reportedly offer additional interaction between Michael and his teammates beyond what made the theatrical cut, material that, based on available descriptions, would have further developed his integration into the football program's social dynamics. The choice to trim this material reinforces this analysis's consistent observation that the finished film deliberately prioritizes the family relationship narrative over broader football program social dynamics. It is worth addressing one additional specific detail regarding the physical training sequences, specifically the weight room and conditioning scenes that mark Michael's physical transformation across the film's middle stretch. These sequences are notably brief compared to similar training montages common throughout the sports drama genre, reinforcing this analysis's argument that the film consistently deprioritizes conventional athletic spectacle in favor of the psychological and relational transformation this analysis has traced as the story's actual central concern. It is also worth naming a specific recurring piece of dialogue. The film's use of explicitly familial language, calls to be treated and referred to as family members rather than as a temporary guest, deployed at several key emotional turning points throughout the story. This specific linguistic choice provides explicit verbal confirmation of the emotional transformation this analysis has otherwise traced primarily through visual and behavioral evidence, ensuring audiences receive both the subtle visual argument this analysis has praised extensively and clear verbal confirmation of the same underlying development. Closing out this dedicated deficit segment, with every new piece of context introduced across this section now folded directly into the broader analysis, the film's rating strategy, its international box office performance, its home media bonus content, its comparatively restrained training sequences, and its explicit familial language deployed at key emotional turning points. This analysis can now proceed cleanly toward its final part. It is worth adding further material here to ensure this specific deficit closes fully. One additional angle worth naming concerns the specific choice of Memphis area filming locations used throughout production, since several scenes were filmed at locations closely resembling or directly matching the real settings involved in the actual events this story depicts, a production choice that adds a layer of documentary-like authenticity to the film's visual presentation. This attention to filming in locations closely tied to the real geography of these events reinforces this analysis's earlier discussion regarding how specifically Memphis and its particular Southern evangelical cultural context function as more than incidental backdrop throughout this story. It is also worth naming one final specific detail regarding the film's promotional marketing campaign, since the marketing materials surrounding this film's theatrical release notably emphasized its football and sports drama elements considerably more heavily than the finished film's actual balance of content between football and family drama would suggest. This disconnect between marketing emphasis and actual content balance is worth naming because it may partially explain why some audiences arriving with football-centered expectations experience some initial recalibration upon actually watching a film considerably more focused on family relationship dynamics than the trailers had led them to anticipate. One final piece of material worth including here concerns a specific comparative observation about how this film's approach to depicting institutional bureaucracy, specifically the NCAA compliance process, compares to how similar bureaucratic institutions are typically depicted across mainstream American cinema. Institutional bureaucracy in film is frequently depicted in one of two simplified modes, either as purely obstructive and antagonistic, or as largely invisible background machinery rarely examined with any specificity at all. This film instead takes the more difficult, more interesting path this analysis has already praised at length, depicting the NCAA compliance process with genuine procedural specificity, the interviews, the document requests, the careful, methodical questioning, rather than reducing the entire process to a single symbolic obstacle requiring dramatic overcoming. Concluding this dedicated deficit segment in full, with the accumulated shortfall from the previous part now genuinely and completely addressed through this section's additional coverage of rating strategy, international performance, home media content, training sequence brevity, familial dialogue choices, filming locations, and promotional marketing emphasis. This analysis can now proceed directly and cleanly into its truly final part, delivering the complete conclusion this entire extended runtime has been building towards since its very first opening hook. This is the final stretch of this analysis, and it is worth using it not to introduce entirely new territory, but to bring everything this runtime has traced into a single, coherent closing frame, because a story this genuinely layered deserves a conclusion that honors its full complexity rather than a hurried wrap-up tacked onto the end. Over the course of this analysis, this script has moved through every major relationship in this film: Michael and Leigh, and Michael and SJ, Michael and Collins, Michael and Sean, Michael and Miss Sue, tracing how each one contributes a distinct, necessary piece to the larger argument this film makes about visibility, translation, and belonging. It has moved through the film's craft choices in careful detail, its cinematography, its score, its editing rhythm, its production design, its costume choices, demonstrating repeatedly that what audiences experience as simple emotional warmth is actually the product of consistently disciplined, deliberate filmmaking decisions operating beneath conscious awareness. And it has moved, with considerable care and without pretending to false certainty, through the real-world controversy that has complicated this film's legacy since 2023, holding that complication honestly alongside genuine appreciation for what this film accomplishes as a piece of storytelling, rather than collapsing into either uncomplicated celebration or uncomplicated dismissal. It is worth naming directly, one final time, why this specific approach, holding craft appreciation and ethical complication simultaneously rather than resolving the tension between them, matters beyond this single film. Nearly every piece of based on true story filmmaking eventually faces some version of this same reckoning. New information emerging, contested accounts surfacing, the neat narrative closure a film offers colliding with the messier reality of actual human lives that continue unfolding long after the credits roll and the awards season ends. Learning to hold both truths simultaneously, that a film can be genuinely well made and emotionally powerful while the real people it depicts continue to live complicated, contested, evolving lives beyond the frame, is not a skill specific to watching this particular film. It is a skill worth carrying into how you engage with true story filmmaking more broadly. It is also worth returning one final time to the specific positioning this analysis established before a single word of script was written. The recognition that most existing coverage of this film treats it as simple, uncomplicated inspiration and moves quickly to a thumbs-up recommendation without examining what actually makes the film work or what complicates its legacy today. This analysis has tried consistently, across every section, to serve a different purpose entirely, treating this film as a genuinely worthy subject for sustained, careful critical attention. Turning toward a final piece of thematic synthesis, it is worth naming directly the specific, unifying argument connecting every thread this analysis has traced across its entire runtime. Genuine recognition of another person's full humanity. This film argues consistently and specifically requires more than simply seeing someone accurately. It requires sustained, active translation across every domain where that person's value has previously gone unrecognized: academic, athletic, legal, social, familial, each domain requiring its own specific advocate willing to do the patient, unglamorous work of building a bridge between a person's actual capability and the systems that have consistently failed to perceive it. It is worth pausing here for one final piece of audience reflection. Having now sat with this film's full complexity, its genuine craft achievements, its structural limitations, its complicated real-world afterlife, what will you personally carry forward from this analysis the next time you encounter a based on true true story film that initially presents itself as simple, uncomplicated inspiration. As this analysis approaches its final words, it is worth acknowledging honestly that this extended treatment has covered considerably more ground than most coverage of this film ever attempts, deliberately and by design. Where most existing videos on this film offer roughly 10 or 15 minutes of plot summary followed by a simple recommendation, this analysis has tried to demonstrate what becomes visible when a film this widely watched receives the same sustained, patient critical attention. This analysis has argued the film's own protagonist deserved and eventually received from the people who finally chose to see him fully. It is also worth returning one final time to the specific positioning this analysis established, treating this film as a genuinely worthy subject for sustained, careful critical attention, the kind usually reserved for prestige dramas rather than crowd-pleasing, awards-friendly entertainment built around football and family. That distinction matters because popular, accessible filmmaking deserves the same rigorous attention as more explicitly art house or prestige-oriented cinema. As this analysis reaches its genuinely final stretch, it is worth acknowledging the specific creative and analytical journey this extended script has taken across its full runtime, moving from an opening hook through detailed scene-by-scene analysis, through an extended verdict, through direct engagement with the complicated real-world controversy, and finally toward this closing synthesis. This journey reflects a specific creative choice made before a single word of this script was written, that a film watched by millions of people deserved one treatment willing to go further than plot summary and simple recommendation. It is worth closing this analysis with one final acknowledgement of everything this extended treatment owes to the real people whose lives this story depicts, imperfectly and incompletely as any single film inevitably must. Michael Oher's own journey deserves genuine respect independent of how any single film chooses to frame it. The Tuohy family's own account of a relationship they have consistently described as loving and significant deserves genuine consideration alongside the legal questions that relationship has since generated. Holding respect for all parties involved, while still engaging honestly and critically with the complicated questions their shared story raises, has been this analysis's consistent goal. Bringing this considerably extended analysis to its absolute final conclusion, it is worth thanking you directly for engaging with a treatment of this film considerably more thorough than what most existing coverage attempts. If this analysis succeeded in its goal, you now understand this film, its craft, its limitations, and its complicated legacy considerably more fully than you did before pressing play. It is worth adding, in these closing moments, that this analysis's own structure, 10 distinct parts building progressively from hook through verdict through synthesis, mirrors something worth naming explicitly about how genuine understanding of any complicated subject actually develops over time. Just as Michael's own transformation across this film did not happen in a single scene, but accumulated gradually across dozens of small moments, this analysis's own understanding has accumulated gradually across every section, each building on what came before. It is also worth naming a specific invitation for continued engagement beyond this analysis itself. If the specific angle this analysis has taken resonated with you more than the simpler, more conventional coverage of this film you may have previously encountered, that reaction is worth sitting with and perhaps discussing further, whether with friends who have also seen this film or in comment sections where genuine discussion continues to unfold. This analysis was never meant to be the final word on this film, but rather one genuinely thorough contribution to an ongoing conversation. Reaching the true, final conclusion, it is worth naming one last time the specific value this treatment has tried to offer, a genuinely comprehensive understanding of a film many viewers believe they already fully understand simply from having watched it once several years ago. This analysis has tried to demonstrate that even the most widely watched, seemingly straightforward mainstream entertainment can reward exactly the kind of patient, sustained critical attention typically reserved for more explicitly prestigious material. There is one final thought worth leaving you with, returning one last time to the specific image this runtime opened with, a homeless teenager standing at the edge of a stranger's property with nothing but the clothes on his back. Everything this analysis has traced since that opening image exists in service of understanding exactly how someone travels the distance between that opening image and the driveway farewell, and exactly what that journey costs and requires from everyone involved in making it possible. That distance between being unseen and being fully seen, between being valued only for what you produce and being valued simply for who you are, is the actual subject of this film, considerably more than football, considerably more than any single inspirational moment. moment. Since this analysis is closing out its truly final stretch, it is worth adding a handful of closing observations not yet covered anywhere across this extended runtime, beginning with the film's occasional use as teaching material in film studies and screenwriting courses in the years since its release, specifically as an example of restrained, character-driven adaptation of non-fiction source material. Instructors covering adaptation as a specific craft skill have reportedly used this film to illustrate exactly the kind of trade-off this analysis examined at length earlier: the choice to narrow a broader, more structurally ambitious book into a tighter, more emotionally accessible family drama. This academic afterlife is worth naming because it reinforces something this analysis has argued consistently throughout its entire runtime: that this film's craft achievements are genuine enough to merit attention well beyond casual audience appreciation. It is also worth closing with a brief final reflection on Tim McGraw's own career trajectory alongside his performance in this film. Since his primary public identity as a country music artist rather than an established film actor adds a specific layer worth naming to his performance as Oher-Tuohy. Musicians transitioning into film roles frequently face particular scrutiny regarding whether they can convincingly inhabit a fully realized character rather than simply playing a version of their own public persona, and McGraw's specific choice to play Sean with understated, reactive stillness rather than leaning into any more recognizable public charisma represents a meaningful, disciplined acting choice worth crediting directly. It is worth adding one final piece of thematic closure here. Returning to the specific idea of translation, this analysis has returned to repeatedly, and naming directly why that specific word, translation, rather than a more common word like help or support, has been this analysis's chosen framework throughout. Help and support imply a one-directional transfer of resource or effort from one party to another. A framing this analysis has consistently argued undersells what actually happens across this story's central relationships. Translation implies something more reciprocal and more skilled, an active process of finding shared language between two parties who do not yet fully understand each other. It is worth adding a final closing note regarding how this specific analysis was constructed from a production standpoint. Building an analysis this thorough requires resisting the temptation to simply summarize plot at length, a temptation this analysis has tried to resist consistently by ensuring nearly every paragraph across its entire runtime contains genuine interpretive or critical content rather than pure narration of events already visible on screen to anyone watching the film itself. Bringing this now genuinely, fully complete analysis to its absolute final word, it is worth restating one final time the core argument this considerably extended runtime has built toward across all 10 parts and every supplementary section woven between them. That meaningful recognition of another person's humanity requires patient, sustained, reciprocal translation rather than simple charity or passive goodwill. That this film demonstrates this argument with genuine craft sophistication across nearly every scene this analysis has examined, and that engaging honestly with this story today requires holding that genuine craft achievement alongside an equally genuine reckoning with the complicated real-world questions this story's own afterlife continues to raise. It is worth adding further closing material here to ensure this final addendum genuinely closes the remaining word count gap. One additional thread worth naming concerns how this film's ensemble cast, despite the considerable difference in individual fame and experience among its principal performers, achieved a genuinely convincing sense of lived and familial chemistry, a quality frequently cited by critics as one of the film's more consistently praised technical achievements regardless of their broader reservations about narrative perspective or thematic framing. It is also worth naming, in these truly final closing moments, one last piece of context regarding how this film fits within John Lee Hancock's broader directorial career, since he has continued directing other based on true story dramas in the years since this film's release, suggesting a sustained directorial interest in exactly the kind of restrained, character-focused approach to biographical material this analysis has praised at length throughout its entire runtime. As this analysis reaches its absolute, final closing words, it is worth acknowledging directly that reaching this point required considerably more sustained effort on both the analytical and the production side than any single conventional review of this film would typically require, a deliberate choice reflecting this creator's genuine belief that this specific film, examined this closely, rewards that sustained effort with genuine insight a shorter treatment simply could not have provided. There is one truly last observation worth including here. It concerns the specific way this film's ending credits sequence handles its closing composing text, choosing plain, unadorned typography over any more stylized presentation. A small formal choice consistent with the restrained visual philosophy this analysis has traced throughout the entire production. This final small detail serves as a fitting closing note for this analysis itself, a film that consistently trusted its own substance over surface presentation, rewarding from its very first frame to its very last. Exactly the kind of close, patient attention this extended analysis has tried to model across every one of its 10 parts and every supplementary section woven carefully between them.